Okay, we're rolling. Well, hello and welcome to episode 17 of Super Deep Movie Analysis. I'm actor and screenwriter Lec Zorn, joined for the first time in this webcast by Robert Landrum. Robert and I met 27 years ago here at Indiana. We met 27 years ago here at Indiana University Southeast in New Albany, Indiana, while we were both serving on the student newspaper staff, The Horizon. We actually met just about 100 feet down the hall in the Horizon office, and I invited Robert on this episode because he's a very big fan of the movie that we're super deep analyzing today, as I am, and I remember watching it with him back in the 90s, and knowing that we were both fans of it, but it's only been in the last 8 years that I've been working in film that I've really become to appreciate this movie for the masterpiece that it is, and I'm talking about very possibly the most super deep analyzed movie of all time, which is Stanley Kubrick's 1980 horror masterpiece, The Shining. So, Robert, to start off, when did you first see The Shining?
I don't remember exactly which theater, but I remember that I first saw it at a drive-in. Now, like I said, I don't remember which one, but it definitely left a deep impression on me when I was a kid. At the time, I would have been 9 years old.
Okay.
Watching the film.
Okay, well, for me, I first saw the movie the night before Halloween in 1981 on Showtime with my father and my brother. My brother and I were at our dad's house for the weekend, and the first R-rated movie I ever saw was Alien 2 years earlier, and my dad, Showtime was showing this horror marathon, and The Shining, I think, was the 8 o'clock, the main feature that night, and I watched it, and I thought it was great, but I didn't appreciate it like I do now, and I saw it, regularly over the years, on Showtime and, other places. Sometimes I'd catch it on regular TV, and then finally, I became to, when I started working in film, and I always say that when you start working in film, it really dramatically changes the way you watch films, and it was then when I really began to appreciate things like the photography and just how brilliantly it was acted and directed and so much more. And then finally, after a few years of working in film, the movie started to become part of my daily vocabulary, quotes from the movie, that is.
Yeah.
And finally, last year, I saw it theatrically for the first time on a special engagement with ACM, or one of those classic movie channels, sponsored a nationwide 2-day engagement, and I went and saw it on the big screen, and didn't really pay much attention to it. As far plot wise, I just took in the finer details of it, and it was just you can appreciate so much more when you see it on the big screen. And so anyway, The Shining was released, of course, in 1980. It was based on a 1977 novel by Stephen King. Now, Robert, you've read the novel.
Yes.
And I have not. I've picked it up. I've read bits and pieces of it. I understand that, it probably wouldn't be a huge exaggeration to say that Kubrick's movie is somewhat loosely based on King's book.
Loosely, as I found out, because I read the novel after I saw the film with my family. Now, it was the paperback that had the original yellow poster with the iconic logo, The Shining. But I read the book, and because even at that age, I was an avid reader.
Yes.
And I read it, and clearly, it was like reading almost a different novel, even though the characters were the same, the basic general plot was the same. It clearly was a different kind of story. But at the same time, I look at it this way. I'm actually kind of glad that it happened in that order, for the simple fact is it just made me appreciate not just Stanley Kubrick as a director and as a cinematographer, which obviously he's second to nobody.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, he was equally a brilliant writer. I think, as far as I'm concerned, he actually told a much better story than Stephen King did.
Well, that's good, and certainly, he Kubrick did have his own agenda. I saw, there was a quote that said, I don't remember who it was from, but one analyst said that, um, some of what you did, that the plot is basically the same between the book and the movie, but that Kubrick's message and emphasis is much different.
Absolutely. I think more than in the King novel, the emphasis is on the hotel.
Yeah.
The hotel as the character. Basically, there are really five major characters in that film. It's very concise, very simple through most of the film. Jack Torrance,
Wendy.
his wife,
Yeah,
Wendy,
yeah.
Danny,
Yeah.
Hallorann,
Yes.
Dick Hallorann,
Yeah.
because he has to be the one to try to rescue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And the hotel,
Yes.
and all the ghosts in it. But in general, the hotel.
Yeah.
The hotel in itself is a character, and that's what Stephen King emphasized was
Yeah.
the hotel. But I think what Kubrick did was to basically say, well, now look, I want to make a horror story, but I want it to be believable. If it's believable, it's even more frightening.
Oh, I agree with you. Yes.
So let's make a horror film that does have supernatural elements, but before you really get into the supernatural stuff at the end, let's make the people assume that this is a story about the disintegration of a family, of a nuclear family.
Yeah. Yeah. And at that, it's very believable.
Extremely believable, and even more frightening because, I mean, even for someone as young as I was at 9 years old, I could appreciate the true significance of the horror. I mean, that the most horrible thing, because, I mean, when you're at that age, that we both were when we both first saw this film
Yeah.
in 80, I mean, most of the horror films that we saw involved monsters, ghosts,
Yeah.
things that were just unreal.
Yeah.
And that by that time we already figured out, okay, it's unreal, it's still scary, but it's unreal.
Yeah.
But what could be more scarier? What could be a more scarier monster
Yeah.
than your own dad?
Yeah, and especially when you're in an isolated place like that, where it's like you go back to the movie Alien. The tagline of that movie is, "In space, no one can hear you scream," and
Right.
you could apply that to the Overlook Hotel as well during the
Yeah.
during the off season.
There's no Hallorann rescuing Ridley.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, to start off, the movie, begins with a magnificent, breathtaking shot from a helicopter of what supposedly Colorado is actually done at Glacier Mountain Park in Montana, but it certainly could pass for Colorado.
Right.
And what I love about that opening scene, what I think makes it so spectacular, is you have the juxtaposition where you have this gorgeous, gorgeous scenery, but then it's combined with this eerie sense of isolation and that haunting music, which is Symphonie Fantastique by Hector Berlioz, the French composer, which was written all the way back in 1830, 150 years before the movie.
And I think the specific song on it was actually a Dies. I'm trying to remember the name.
Yeah, I can't
But-
pronounce it, but I
but-
think you know. I know
But
what
it's
you're
a
talking
but it's a Latin for Day of Judgment,
about.
Judgment Day.
Yeah, I think that's
but,
right.
But it's a music that is traditionally played during a Catholic mass for the dead.
Yes.
Basically, a Catholic funeral.
Yeah. So certainly it's very, very ominous, and I just think the combination, like I said, of the scenery with the isolation and the music, it really does a great job setting the tone for the movie.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it just goes to the work that Stanley Kubrick did. I mean, it wasn't just enough to have this great scene and whatnot, but also, among other things, you have the right sound,
Oh,
the right
yeah.
feel, the
Yeah.
right music that gives something either the right vibe. And clearly, I mean, right from the get-go, right from the very beginning, with the opening credits and everything, you clearly get a vibe that something uncanny is happening.
Yeah, and I love how you see that side winding road, where Jack is driving his yellow VW Bug, and like he's driving to the end of the earth, and it's very well shot. And I've been to Colorado a couple of times, and there are parts of it that are like that,
Yeah.
where you're driving up there in the mountains, the air is very thin, and in fact, Stephen King wrote his inspiration for The Overlook, as you might know, was a visit that he made to the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, and he was there the night after they closed for the season, but they let him stay that night anywhere because they let him stay that night anyway because he asked to, and he paid for a room, and they just let him have it, and he ended up being served. I don't know if you know this, but he ended up being served there by a bartender named Grady. So he got a lot of inspiration out of that visit. But anyway,
Charles or Delbert?
Yeah, I never heard that part, and we're going to get to that later.
Yeah.
Actually, in the very near future. So anyway, Jack he survives that sidewinding road. He arrives at the Overlook Hotel, which is it's interesting. I was surprised to find this out. Now, the outside is a real hotel in Oregon, but the inside was entirely a studio.
Right.
And today, and if I remember correctly, the Overlook Hotel was actually the largest movie set ever constructed up to that time. I could be wrong. I think I read that a few years ago.
Well, it certainly would make sense because, I mean, it is quite massive. And also, another thing I also heard that the interiors, he actually based the interior scenes from several different hotels because he did a lot of research in in everything that he would do. I mean, he was famous for the kind of research and delving into the minutia of whatever it is that he is researching for whatever movie that he's about to film.
Oh yeah.
And the Shining was definitely no different. The interiors were from several different hotels that he has witnessed.
Okay, I didn't know that part, but I did know the part about that he was a meticulous researcher and that he hired meticulous researchers and paid them good money to do research for months to prepare for his movies. And that was of course the case with The Shining. And he had he hired a team of researchers to spend 2 or 3 months just researching Colorado history.
Yes.
And even though the film was, it was the most of it was filmed in the United Kingdom at a studio. And although I had no idea, I figured they actually got a hotel. Now, Stephen King in 1997 released a miniseries version of The Shining that I understand is a much more close adaptation of his book.
Yes.
And that actually was filmed at the Stanley Hotel. They filmed it there during the off season. And ironically, the Stanley Hotel now is open year round. So I guess they finally found a way to make it feasible to keep the roads cleared.
And I guarantee you, room 217 is very popular.
I'm sure it is, yeah. And more on that later when we get to that scene. But so anyway, Jack walks into the hotel and he has his appointment with Stuart Ullman, the hotel manager, played by Barry Nelson. A piece of trivia about Barry Nelson, now you ask most people who was the first actor ever to play James Bond, and almost everybody says Sean Connery. Well, in the official film series, that's right. But prior to that, in 1954, there was an episode of the anthology TV series Climax, in which they did an episode based on the book Casino Royale, where Barry Nelson actually played Bond. So you can see the episode on YouTube. That was 26 years before The Shining. But anyway, so Ullman is friendly, which I understand is quite in contrast to the book.
Oh, right, absolutely. In the book, he makes it very, very clear that the only reason that Jack is being hired, although another thing in the book, the name of the main character is actually John Torrance.
Okay. All right.
Which is, I don't know why Stanley would change that. I guess mainly out of courtesy for Jack.
Yeah, I don't know, but
The only reason that he is even allowing him to be hired was because his superior ordered him to, and
right,
that's
yeah,
it.
yeah, and that's what's said in the miniseries as well.
Yeah.
In which Ullman is played by Elliot Gould. But anyway, though, so the scene is starts off pretty routine with Jack. Unlike the book, Jack isn't running from a shady past. He seems to be taking this job because he wants it, because he wants the privacy to write a book, and he and Ullman have a nice conversation. And then, however, Ullman warns Jack about the tragedy that took place in the winter of 1970 when the caretaker Charles Grady, and the first name, causing much confusion and debate and speculation. But anyways, that Charles Grady had murdered his wife and daughters with an axe and shot himself to death. And Ullman, expresses concern that Jack might not want to take the job after that. But Jack says that it won't happen to him, and then and something that's also pretty funny, he said that his wife will find it fascinating because she's a
Ghost story and horror film addict.
Now the way that we see Wendy later in the film, does she really seem like she's a horror and ghost story addict? I mean, someone who's that feeble and.
I almost wonder sometimes if Stanley Kubrick basically made her essentially play like almost a masochistic role.
Well, yeah, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but by many accounts, including from Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson, Kubrick, just treated Shelley Duvall terribly, and it's even speculated that he sabotaged the heating in her room to make her in this hysterical state all the time. And of course, on top of that, it's known that Kubrick ordered dozens and even hundreds of takes of certain scenes.
120. Well, we'll get to that scene.
Yeah, but the thing is, so, I mean, for me, I'm an actor myself, and I think the most takes I've ever, I think at one time there was a fight scene where I did about 20 takes, and that really took its toll. I mean, not where I was like, going crazy or anything like that, but it was exhausting. So I can only imagine, some of these scenes, well, doing anything, even if you're just sitting down, doing the same thing 50, 100 times, it's going to just drive you nuts.
But imagine that scene, and of course I know it's much later,
Yeah.
but imagine doing that scene where Wendy discovers what Jack has been writing.
Oh, yeah.
When Jack finally basically reveals his madness and his intention to kill his family, and going up the stairs and him going, Wendy,
Yeah,
give me the bat. Imagine doing that scene 127 times.
Oh, yeah, I mean, first of all, just the fatigue of climbing up a flight of steps that many times in a row, that alone, and then not to mention everything else, the terror that you have to express, and, yeah.
There's a reason why Shelley Duvall, by the latter third of the film,
Yeah.
is looking horrified, terrified, like
Yeah.
her world is falling apart with all the things that are happening in the
Yeah.
film. It's very realistic, and there's a good reason.
Of course, yeah. And I think one thing that I've learned, in acting is that so many times, I mean, you give your best performance paradoxically when you're not actually acting. I mean, let me give you an example. I mean, recently I was in a film where I played a guy who suffers from depersonalization disorder, and we were doing a scene on the part of the parking garage, and I happened to be afraid of heights, and we were like 6 or 7 stories up. So anyway, the director, Austin Daniel Clodfelter, wanted a shot of me looking like I was freaked out. So I intentionally stuck my head over and looked straight down because I knew I would freak out, and I did, and he got a great shot out of it. So, I looked more freaked out because I really was freaked out than if I had tried to fake it,
Right.
So I think Kubrick knew the mind games to play with Shelley Duvall to get the reaction. And remember, The Shining was shot in something like 520 days, right, just under a year and a half.
Right.
And most major studio movies are shot in 2 or 3 months. So, you know,
And the reason he could do that, and the reason he could get away with that,
yeah,
was, well, for starters, Warner Brothers trusted Stanley Kubrick implicitly.
oh yeah, with good reason.
Well, of course,
Yeah.
because they know that he will deliver the goods.
Yeah.
But here's the big secret, and this is something that I learned recently, and the more I think about it, it makes sense. I didn't realize until Adam Savage said this in a tour of the Stanley Kubrick archives, that Stanley Kubrick owned his own film equipment. He owned all the cameras, all the lights.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, when you think about most studios, you have to rent your cameras, rent this, rent that from the studio.
Right.
So basically, it's like being in a recording studio.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between being like, say, recording an album at Abbey Road,
Right.
and recording an album in your basement that you've converted into an 8-track recording studio.
Yeah, and there are recording artists, for example, who've made a lot more money than others just by making albums in their own studios.
Right.
And so it's it's something where, I mean, it's a good business decision, if you have the talents to use that equipment that you buy, which obviously Kubrick did.
And because he owns his own equipment, that means that the studios would only need to worry about, okay, getting him the actors and actresses that he needs for this particular film, and they could concentrate on other things, and he could basically he could do 127 takes of a particular scene if you own the equipment and you own basically you own the store.
Yeah.
So you don't have the films. Basically, he owns his own. He owns the means of production, and all the film studio has to do is basically just dole out a little bit of money, and it doesn't even have to be. I don't really think that he made big budget films.
No, The Shining was a $12 million movie, which at the time it was big, but it wasn't through the roof.
Right. I mean, even if you adjusted for inflation, it probably would pale in comparison to some of the.
Yeah, I mean, it would probably be like 30 million today or something.
Yeah, probably around that.
Yeah. So yeah, it was not. I mean, for example, two widely bashed movies that came out that same year, Can't Stop the Music, which starred the Village People, and Xanadu, which starred Olivia Newton-John, both had $20 million budgets.
Oh God.
So, it's one thing I've learned from 8 years of film: budgets are one of the most overrated aspects of film. Now, they're not insignificant, but they are overrated.
Right.
A little budget and a big imagination go a long way. And so, obviously Kubrick proved that.
Oh yeah, and he knew how to film imagination.
Oh yeah, and so you look at it. I mean, technology was nowhere near in 1980 what it is today, and so many of the shots in that movie are just so iconic. And there are movies that are had 10 times the budget, 20 times the budget today, and you don't have any shots that people just instantly recognize and remember. Like, you look at my shirt, for example. It's, for those of you who didn't notice, it's the Grady girls, which we'll talk about later. But
hello, Daddy.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I've gotten more reaction to this shirt than any other shirt I've ever worn. And people stop me regularly on the street and say, "Oh yeah, those are the girls from The Shining." And and I've gotten some negative reactions. Like one time a cashier at McDonald's about a year ago, she saw me wear the shirt. She said, "Oh, you're evil." And so I enjoy the reaction, but sometimes people walk up.
That's the amazing thing. It's like, look at the shirt.
Yeah.
It's two little girls wearing nice blue dresses.
Yeah.
Blue and pink dresses. They're holding hands. There's nothing overtly wrong, and yet, when you see it in The Shining, it's like just the way he sings it, the way the music comes on in the background, just that visual look
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of the most famous moments in movie history, and we'll get to that a little later. But yeah, I mean, some of those people will walk up to me and say, "Oh, that is awesome," referring to the shirt, and yeah, I love the reaction people get to it, and so and you have movies today where that some of the biggest budget movies, and there's not one iconic image that will attract that kind of attention.
Right, because it's all about the CGI now. It's all about whiz, bam, wow.
Oh yeah, I mean some of the things are like, for example, the blood pouring out of the elevators. I've read the story about how they actually did that, but
It took nearly a year to film that.
okay, I didn't remember that part of it. I know it was quite a major task, but the point is today it would probably all be done on a computer.
Oh, of course, of
And
course, of
for
course.
probably most of the Overlook Hotel would have been done on a computer. And
I mean, they could have gone all George Lucas on that, and just and unfortunately, I mean George Lucas prequels,
yeah.
and just basically have everybody in a green room,
Hmm.
all green, and then with a press of a few buttons, there's the Overlook Hotel.
Oh yeah,
it's,
yeah.
it's crazy now.
Oh, it is, yeah.
And I also think that's the reason why a lot of films today involve superheroes and things like that, comic book stuff, because it's easy to do CGI stuff with that.
Oh, it is, yeah, and it's gotten to the point where the actors and the story are almost secondary. I shouldn't even say almost. I think because a lot of times they really are secondary or even tertiary.
Yeah.
Like in the Jurassic Park movies.
Or or the fan stick four,
Whatever,
fantastic.
yeah.
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 that crap.
Yeah, it's not my cup of tea either.
Now,
But
and granted, I love Star Wars.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really,
that's fine.
really do. But you know, man, what happened with the prequels murder? And and I guess that's why looking at films today, it just makes me appreciate not just The Shining,
Mhm.
but Stanley Kubrick that much more, because you got to look at the horror films that were contemporary,
Yeah.
contemporary to The Shining. I mean, just before that, you mentioned Alien.
Yeah.
There were other horror films from the 70s. I'm trying to think of some right now.
Well, Halloween is widely credited with helping spearhead the slasher era, but Halloween is not really representative of the slasher era, even though it spawned a lot of those films. I mean, Halloween, for example, was not a gore fest. It was, it did, go. It was very brave in some of the things it did.
Friday the 13th.
It was Friday the 13th really was the beginning of the gore fest era. And then
That's when horror film just
we're basically, yeah, I mean, basically where it became more about making you feel disgusted than about scaring you.
right.
And you see, I've read a lot of Steve. It's well known that Stephen King was not a big fan of the Kubrick movie. He didn't hate it. He said that his positive and negative feelings balanced out to zero about the movie. But
Yeah.
he was he did love the cinematography. He was very hard on a lot of the. He was very hard on the casting of Jack Nicholson. King wanted John Voight to play Jack, and
Yeah.
you know.
I totally don't understand, and the big reason that he cited for not wanting Jack was
Yeah.
because Stephen King wanted John Torrance,
Yeah.
his character,
Yeah.
to basically be this lovable, good old, honest to goodness American dad
Yeah.
that slowly but surely goes insane.
Mhm.
In other words, you get all American dad to psycho killer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He wanted it to be a surprise and he felt like if everybody would expect Jack to go crazy because Jack Nicholson plays crazy characters, and
Mhm.
of course he's the master at it.
And that's why Stanley Kubrick hired him.
Yeah, and that's one thing. One of the big differences between the. Have you ever seen the miniseries, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think one thing I will say between the movie and the miniseries, I find Danny and Hallorann to be very similar characters, but Jack and Wendy, about the only thing they have in common are their names. The personalities are completely different. Between the Jack and Wendy in the Kubrick version and Jack and Wendy in the King version.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. In in the King novel,
Yeah.
as well as the miniseries, Wendy is pretty much a
Strong, independent.
strong, independent, blonde woman that knows what she's doing.
Yeah, and Kubrick, turned her into a character who was very meek, submissive, almost intentionally ugly, and
I don't think so much intentionally ugly, so much as someone who has been worn, worn down, worn down from. I'm going to assume that not only was Danny physically abused. I mean, the evidence is obvious in both the book and in the film, but clearly there seems to be signs that Jack was also just equally abusive. Maybe not physically abusive on his wife, but potentially
treating her like a doormat at least.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And,
emotionally abusive for sure.
yeah, and I think a lot of the criticism that King, even though I don't agree with a lot of it, I think a lot of his criticism is fair. I mean, I can understand why King wasn't happy that Kubrick largely took alcoholism out of the story. Certainly downplayed it tremendously. But I think one thing that King said that I completely disagree with is that one of the problems with the movie is that Kubrick didn't understand the horror genre. I don't agree with that at all. I think Kubrick made a horror masterpiece.
He made a classic horror.
Yeah.
And I'm not even talking about the classic horror from the 40s and 50s, that sort of horror. I'm talking about 19th century Gothic horror.
Yeah, and the thing is horror, I think, is supposed to be about scaring you. It's supposed to be about suspense, and and that's think about it, only one person gets killed in the entire movie of The Shining, and it's one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. I mean, you see those Friday the 13th movies, 15 people get killed roughly per movie, but for the most part, they're not really that scary. They're
Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Oh, that was another one that came out before.
Yeah.
I was just trying to think of all the horror films before that. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think with them, it was all about the blood and guts and gore and visual shock.
Yeah.
Whereas with Kubrick, it's more like an emotional shock.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when I was a kid, I couldn't go to bed after I saw The Shining. I mean, I was so freaked out by it, and so it was. Kubrick knew how to get inside your head, and that's something that really none of those slasher movies I don't think did.
Yeah,
And
because you knew they were fake.
yeah, exactly, and Kubrick did make it seem very real, and of course, obviously, you had outstanding performances, and the scenery, and the music, and the cinematography, the camera angles, so many things just all worked together masterfully, and the one thing I will say about the slasher movies, they tended to be very well edited, which made some of the killings seem real, but generally they're badly acted, badly written, and it just they tend to be very low class. I mean, the only reason to watch them is to if you like it, seeing people get killed.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, one of the exceptions, and this wasn't from the 70s. I mean, we're talking about the 60s now. Is Psycho.
Oh yeah, well I don't even consider Psycho a horror as much as a mystery thriller.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the shower scene and then the scene where Arbogast gets killed at the top of the stairs, I mean, really, it's mainly just it's more of a mystery. It's a mystery than
a suspense thriller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, obviously, the shower scene was groundbreaking, and it spawned, some more gruesome movies. But yeah, I mean, Psycho is a very first-class movie, and Hitchcock, obviously, he was a guy like Kubrick who's very, very meticulous, very much into odd camera angles, and able to just use the camera to make things a lot more effective. And, when you look at the three Psycho sequels that Anthony Perkins made after Hitchcock's death, they're not bad, but they're shot very conventionally, so the impact is far less. I mean, they could have been made by just any average director.
Right.
But anyway, back to The Shining, though. So Jack, he does the interview with Ullman. It goes well, and Jack decides that it's obvious that Jack is going to get the job.
Right.
And then we're introduced to his wife and son, Wendy, played by Shelley Duvall, Danny, played by Danny Lloyd, and it's interesting. Wendy's sitting there, she's smoking a cigarette. Now, was Wendy a smoker in the book?
I don't know.
Okay. Because I wondered if Kubrick added that to make Wendy look even more nervous.
Well, I mean, we are talking about. Well, the book was written in 1976 or 77.
It was released in '77.
Yeah, so it wouldn't have been uncommon for. Well, I mean, smoking was still pretty much what a majority of Americans did. So it probably. It's possible that both parents were smokers.
It is possible. Yeah, we really don't know. It's just one of those things that it did come to my mind though that maybe Kubrick included it to make Wendy look more nervous.
But Jack Torrance was also a smoker as well.
Okay.
I definitely remember the pack of cigarettes and a cigarette still burning in an ashtray next to the typewriter in the scene where he's throwing the tennis ball against the wall.
Okay. So Wendy's also reading Catcher in the Rye while she's talking to Danny. Do you think there's any special significance to that?
Well,
she's reading Catcher in the Rye while Danny is drinking a glass of milk and eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Well, Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger's famous work. It involves basically a 17-year-old boy that's been kicked out of boarding school again.
Yeah.
And he goes on New York for an adventure and basically has a very bad time and ends up in a mental institution at the end. But I'm pretty sure that somebody else has figured out the significance of why she is reading this book and why it's there. But right now, I have no idea.
It could be just random. We don't know, but
I mean, it could be. I mean, I remember in that scene, there was a ton of paperback books. I mean, clearly, Kubrick is establishing the fact that Wendy and maybe Jack as well are readers.
Yeah.
They read lots of books.
And Jack, we know, was a school teacher, so
and a writer, or a wannabe writer at the very least. But maybe a writer in his own right. We don't really know of any past works, but we definitely know that part of the reason that he wants to go work in that hotel is to write at first, and this is in the novel more than in the film, he wants to write a biography.
Yeah.
And then later he finds this information about the hotel that we actually get to see. He finds a scrapbook.
Yeah.
And in Kubrick's film, we actually see that scrapbook one time.
Yeah.
During that scene where Wendy and Jack are having the fight in that Colorado, I guess they call it the Colorado Lounge.
I don't remember the name of that. I remember the Gold Room was the ballroom, but I don't remember what the name of the lounge was where Jack was typing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I don't remember, but I remember. Yeah, we do get one look at it. It's really odd that there are, since Kubrick seemed to not really have that much respect for the source material that he based his movie on, that he still put in a few references that you would have to know something about the book to get. Like, for example, Jack in an early scene is wearing a Stovington T-shirt when Stovington was the name of the school he taught out in the book. And of course, the man in the dog suit, at the end, that's a reference to something that was in the book as well.
Yes.
And we'll get to that later. But yeah, it was interesting that Kubrick put all those things in from the book that that you wouldn't understand without having read the book, even though he apparently, had no problem taking a lot of liberties and changing things. But
yeah.
But anyway, so At first, Danny seems like a regular kid. He has this imaginary friend named Tony who, talks with. Danny's wiggling his finger, which actually Danny Lloyd, the actor, came up with that idea.
I know. The very interesting because in the book, he's more Danny's imaginary friend Tony
Yeah.
is more a visual hallucination.
Yeah.
And on this one, he's like, "No, it ain't, Mr. Torrance."
Yeah. And so at first you think Danny's just a regular kid who has an imaginary friend. Yeah, no big deal. And of course, in the miniseries, Tony was a vision, and of course we don't see what Tony is until the very last scene. We finally fully understand it. But in the miniseries, Tony is a teenage boy who tries to give Danny warnings about the future. And sometimes Danny heeds them, sometimes he doesn't. And then finally, in the last scene, it makes sense. But here in the Kubrick version, at first you think it's innocuous, but then well, first Wendy's talking to Danny, asking him if he wants to go to the Overlook, and he seems like like he's kind of okay with it. He doesn't seem to have a lot of friends around there, and it is said that the family recently moved to Vermont, and so could be a case where the kid's new in town and really hasn't had time to make a lot of friends yet.
Right.
And Wendy seems like a regular, she's mild mannered, loving mom and housewife. So she seems like a good person at first, and makes a good first impression. And then though Danny's in the bathroom, and he's talking to Tony, and since Tony had said previously that he didn't want to go to the hotel,
Right.
in the conversation with Wendy and the first time we see them. And then finally Danny prods Tony about why he doesn't want to go to the Overlook, and then you have that horrifying vision of the twin girls, and which of course you don't understand the significance of the two girls at first.
Right.
But then the blood coming out of the elevators, and Danny passes out, and Wendy calls a doctor, a middle-aged woman, who assures Wendy that it's completely normal, nothing's wrong with him, and it probably never happen again. And so Wendy's accepts it, and we don't even know that she even told Jack about it, because there's no
Actually, we do, because
really?
if you remember in the bedroom scene where Jack comes from room 237.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah, you're right.
It wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't put the two together, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
That's why I got two people to do this instead of just one. But
Yeah, and the thing that gets me is King wanted Jack's character to be this mild-mannered, all-American dad
Yeah.
sort of thing, but even in the book,
Yeah.
and of course in the film especially, we find out very early on that Jack abused physically his son Danny,
Oh yeah.
at one point breaking his arm.
Yeah, and of course, and that's one thing I should have mentioned. Wendy did tell the doctor that Jack did once accidentally break Danny's collarbone by jerking him up when he had thrown some of Jack's papers on the floor.
Right.
And Jack had come home after a drinking binge, but then after that incident, he said he would never touch another drop, and that he has been alcohol free for 5 months now, and that's about the closest thing that the movie ever reveals to Jack having a drinking problem, which of course is much more mentioned in the miniseries, where it's a very prominent theme to the point that you see Jack going to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, at one point.
Right. In the miniseries.
In the miniseries, yes, but like I said, in the Kubrick movie, about the closest thing to an overt mention of Jack's alcoholism is the scene where Wendy's saying that Jack, broke Danny's collarbone after the drinking binge and now hasn't had any alcohol in 5 months.
And then, of course, later in the film, a scene that I definitely want to get into detail on that,
Yeah.
because really it's the central to me, that the scene with Jack and Lloyd.
Yes,
The first scene.
yes, awesome.
It's like the central. It's like the center point of the film.
Yeah, it's a great scene,
When, and the only reason I'm mentioning it now is because in that scene we get that same thing that Wendy is talking to the pediatrician about,
Yeah.
from Jack's point of view.
Oh yeah. It is very interesting.
But I'll wait till later to explain that further. But
Oh, yeah.
basically,
So, anyway, so obviously Jack gets the job, and then we see the Torrances going out in the VW bug back down the side winding road again, and this is the first time we see interaction between Jack and Danny. And Jack, he doesn't come across quite as abusive, but he does seem a little bit grumpy when Danny claims that he's, claims that he's hungry, and Jack just sort of, sarcastic.
well, you should have eaten your breakfast.
Yeah, that's about the tone he used. Yeah, and then they end up in Jack and Danny have an interesting conversation about the Donner Party.
Oh yeah.
And Jack, gives kind of an odd reaction after Wendy tries to stop the conversation, and Danny assures his mother that he understands it.
Because he saw it on TV. See, it's okay. He saw it on the television.
Yeah, that's what he said. Yeah.
And there's this little hint of sarcasm, like
Yeah.
almost like
So, yeah, you don't get the impression that they're a loving family. You do see that Wendy has a natural motherly attachment to Danny, and Danny to Wendy, but you don't see that Jack has a great love for either of them. And you do sense that he is very much the dominant one in the household.
Right.
And that Wendy's the one who cooks and cleans, and makes sure she always has the meals ready on time. And,
yeah, for good reason.
yeah. So they arrive at the hotel, and they get the grand tour, and we see Danny in the game room tossing darts. That movie was made shortly before the video game revolution took off, so that's probably typical about what they would have at a hotel game room at that time, darts. And everybody remembers the little girls from the hallway scene, but it's easy to forget they make an appearance prior to that when Danny's throwing the darts. They walk in, and of course Danny had previously seen them in that vision from Tony,
Right.
for just about a tenth of a second, but they walk in and they just give each other sort of a smirk and walk out, and it's very eerie and mysterious, and of course the viewer doesn't know who they are at that point.
Right. I mean, the only thing that they know is I saw those girls in the
Yeah.
vision, and the fact that it's like they're in the flesh.
Yeah. So
And you have in the background this eerie, suspenseful music that clearly it's like something's not right about those. There's something about those girls that we should pay attention to.
oh yeah, and Danny, he looks concerned.
But
and-
not overly. That's the thing. I mean, you contrast Wendy's reactions
Yeah.
by the end of the film versus Danny's at this point.
Yeah.
He sees ghosts
Yeah.
and he's like,
Yeah, he is more composed, and he's a very introspective, analytical kid, and he does, even in perilous situations, seemed, to stay composed most of the time. Certainly more so than his mother.
oh God, yeah.
But anyway, so Jack and Wendy are shown all around, and told about the great history of the Overlook, and the war presidents, movie stars, and royalty have stayed there. And speaking of presidents staying there, I think somebody ought to write a movie about Trump visiting the Overlook. That'd make a great comedy. But
He'd
anyway.
probably call it a dump.
Yeah, probably. But anyway, though.
Either that or try to buy it so he can put his name on it.
Yeah.
You just have to call his Russian banker.
Yeah, no doubt about that. But anyway, though, so along the way, Jack and Wendy meet Dick Hallorann, played by Scatman Crothers, who I believe is the only Hoosier in the movie. I just found out about a year ago he's from Terre Haute, and it was probably he acted for a long time. In fact, he was a close friend of Jack Nicholson. They appeared in several films together, but The Shining is what he became best known for. Unfortunately, he died just a few years later in 1986 from lung cancer. But certainly gave a great performance there in The Shining, and very memorable, and certainly one of the good guys of the movie. And he quickly strikes up a friendship with Danny, and in another odd moment, before we really understand what The Shining is, he telepathically asks Danny if he wants some ice cream, and he also knows without being told that Danny was called Doc by his parents, and so anyway, Hallorann asks for permission from Danny's parents to give Danny ice cream, and they grant it, and the two have a very interesting intergenerational conversation.
Yeah, I mean, up until that point when Hallorann says, "How you like some ice cream?"
Yeah.
All of the things that we would consider supernatural, the visions that Danny has, seeing the twin girls in the games room,
Yeah.
all of that could easily be dismissed as something that Danny is seeing in his head.
Yeah.
It's all psychological.
Yeah.
But then the moment he goes, "How you like some ice cream, Doc?"
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
It's like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. So it's it's certainly very it's an interesting moment when you realize that Danny isn't alone, and that this all isn't just it's not just a delusional kid,
Right.
And
with an overactive imagination, imaginary friend. Up until that point, it's like, oh well, he's just really scared. He's going to a new place. He's going to be alone. Winter's coming. Blah 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 blah. But then, he likes some ice cream, Doc.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah. So then Mr. Hallorann explains that he and his grandmother both had this gift called the Shining, where they could have conversations for hours without ever speaking.
Right.
And so it makes you wonder if it's a genetic thing, and if any of Danny's relatives had it, although there's no evidence that's the case.
Well, the fact that he mentioned that this Shining
Yeah.
involves obviously conversing mentally. You're talking about telepathy.
Yeah.
Being able to see visions of the past and the future.
Yeah.
Precognition and cognition.
Yeah, so obviously, it's interesting to learn that it's interesting to see the interaction between two very different people. You have and a black man who's I guess in his 60s with a little kid, and yet they share this rare power, and are connecting intergenerationally, and Danny seems to open up and to probably feels a comfort with Mr. Hallorann that he doesn't feel for his own father, who we can already tell is someone who seems to get irritated rather easily. And then Danny asks about room 237, which Hallorann you can tell that Hallorann is concerned but doesn't want to open up about it
Right,
completely.
because throughout that particular scene, it's like he knows that the boy needs to know, but he doesn't quite.
Yeah.
How do you explain
Yeah.
something like that to a little kid?
And what Hallorann tries to do is to use the analogy that that sometimes places can shine too and leave traces of things that happened in the past, including bad things. But
Right. Say when someone burns toast.
Yeah. And
I mean, it sounds like a silly analogy, but I mean, think about it from a kid's perspective. What happens when you burn toast?
yeah, I mean obviously there's a bad smell. You leave ashes around.
And that smell can last quite a long time.
Yeah. So obviously Hallorann, and you can tell by his stern warning of Danny to stay out of room 237 that Hallorann knows something's not right there.
Something really bad happened there.
Yeah. And so anyway, so everybody leaves, and Jack, Wendy, and Danny are there alone, and at first doesn't seem too bad, but there are a couple of really interesting moments there early, early in the off season. There's one where you just see a picture, or you just see a shot of Jack just. I don't remember whether he's sitting or standing, but he's already, you can see that he's not shaving anymore, and he's standing there with a sweater, and he just has this really odd look on his face.
The Kubrick stare.
Yeah.
Well, that's more like that has happened already after he and Wendy had that fight in the Colorado Lounge
I didn't
about
remember
the
that one. Okay.
rules. Yeah, so that's a little later on.
But
But in the meantime, after we get done with Hallorann and Danny,
Yeah.
it's a month later,
Yeah.
and Wendy is coming from the kitchen.
Oh yes, yes. And this is the first scene where you really think that something isn't. There's something seriously wrong with Jack. Where Wendy innocently tries to bring Jack some food and ask how he's doing, and then Jack we really start to see his dark humor there, where it's like, Wendy, whenever you come in here and I'm typing.
No, that's actually later.
Oh, okay, really?
In the
Okay.
bedroom
Okay.
scene, first thing that happens is Wendy arrives at the bedroom, and you see what you think is Jack sleeping.
Okay.
But as the camera pans out, you realize that what you're actually seeing is the mirror
Okay.
reflecting
Yeah,
Jack
that's right.
sleeping.
Yeah, that's where he's wearing the Stovington shirt, isn't it?
And
Yeah.
he's wearing the Stovington shirt, and you realize that's the reason why it's backwards, because
Yeah.
you're looking at a mirror image.
Yeah.
Kind of a neat little trick that Stanley Kubrick plays on your imagination. But anyway, at the end of it, Jack is going, Wendy, when I came here from the interview,
Yeah.
it's almost as though I've been here before.
Yeah.
Now, we all have had our moments of deja vu, but this is ridiculous.
And of course
It
that
seems like I knew what was going to be around every corner.
and that line becomes a lot more significant in the last scene, when we finally fully understand that line.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Picture.
Yes, which of course we'll get to at the end. But
Right.
yeah, that's obviously it's a line that probably a lot of people didn't really think deeply about it at first, but it turns out to be much more significant than it seemed at the time. And then later you see like the first time you really see something's wrong with Jack is the scene I started to mention earlier, when he's typing and Wendy comes down and breaks his conversation, trying to act real and cheerful. Well, the first time, the first line where you realize something's wrong with Jack is when she says cheerfully that the weatherman says it's supposed to snow, and he says,
Well, what do you want me to do about it?
"Oh,
Oh,
come on, don't be grouchy."
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Yeah, and then of course you see a lot of Jack's dark humor, like whenever I'm here and you hear me typing, whenever I'm in here and you hear me typing,
Or whether you don't hear me typing, what the fuck you hear me doing in here? When I am in here, that means that I am working.
yeah,
That means don't come in.
yeah, and then she goes, "Okay."
Now, we're going to make a new rule. Oh, wait, that was it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
Okay.
Boom.
Yeah. And the
It's
thing
like,
is,
okay.
And the Wendy and the miniatures would have given Jack a frying pan to the head for saying that.
Of course, which is precisely why he hired Shelley Duvall instead.
Oh yeah. 'Cause, obviously Kubrick had his own. For what Kubrick wanted to do with the characters, he hired the right people. There's no question about it. I mean, John Voight might have been good to play Jack's version, Stephen King's version of Jack, but Kubrick obviously had his own
Exactly.
version, and yeah, that was and I just got a kick out of how Wendy sits, there, meekly, just go, okay, and so she, has
She's used to it.
yeah, and
It's clear from this particular scene that this kind of interaction between these two is something that is very common and very
yeah, that
something
Wendy doesn't seem shocked by it,
right,
and
because she's gotten used to it, sadly.
yeah, and so that now that's when the viewer realizes it was the first time that Jack's really a bad guy, and then there's you see things like the Kubrick stare where Jack's just Jack's just sort of frozen there with when
Looking outside, looking at the two playing in the snow, like, what is this guy thinking?
yeah, and then there's that other really odd scene where he's throwing I think a tennis ball against the wall repeatedly for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
And they're both that scene with the tennis ball is really oddly shot because it's done from a great distance and you don't really know what's going through his head. And what's ironic is that in the screenplay for that scene, all it said is Jack isn't working. And so
Jack Nicholson decides, okay, what would I do? Well, this is what he actually said in an interview in that particular scene. He says, okay, I can imagine myself I'm inside a hotel.
Yeah.
I'm trapped. It's snowing outside. I can't get out. But I'm suffering from writer's block, so I can't type.
Yeah.
So, what would I do at that point? I would probably do something inside that I would have done outside.
Yeah.
And that's when he thought about throwing a tennis ball
Yeah.
against the wall.
Yeah, and of course, remember I think it was the scene where Jack's in bed where Wendy asks Jack if he has any ideas, and he said a lot of ideas, no good ones.
Right.
So you can see that we get the impression that he has writer's block, and
yeah.
meanwhile, Wendy's doing her wifely and motherly duties.
So already, even right there at
Yeah.
that point, there's a hint of frustration going on.
Oh yeah.
He's a frustrated writer. He can't write. And then at the very next scene is when you see the typewriter. Not a word is typed.
Yeah.
The cigarette smoking in the
Yeah.
ashtray, the pan out until you see Jack throwing a tennis ball against the wall, catching it, throwing, catching, throwing, catching.
Oh yeah, yeah. And then meanwhile, while Wendy, she's doing her cooking and cleaning, and I know that the boiler was a major plot element in the mini series, and I guess the book as well. And I guess when we see one scene where Wendy's attending to the boiler, although it's not a major plot element in the Kubrick movie at all.
No, and what's more, you notice that boiler
Yeah.
is much more newer, cleaner,
Oh right, and
and it works
Yes.
just like it should.
Yeah, that's right. But then, meanwhile, Danny, he drives his tricycle around, and before we get into this part of the tricycle scene, I think one thing that makes that scene so incredible is it's one of the best tracking sequences I've ever seen, and I don't know if you know this, but it was shot by a very famous cinematographer named Garrett Brown. I mean, he's not famous to the general public, but he's a legend in the film industry, and he invented the Steadicam.
Yep.
And now, do you know what the first movie to use the Steadicam was?
No.
It was Rocky. And,
Oh.
And
During the jogging scene?
yes, and it was Garrett Brown who shot that as well. And he actually, when he invented the Steadicam, which of course, for those of you who don't know, a Steadicam is a camera in which during a heavy action shot it maintains a steady picture. And basically, somebody from Rocky saw a demonstration video that Garrett Brown made of his wife walking down a flight of steps, and so he ended up shooting that scene in Rocky of Stallone running up the steps. And so then they brought in Garrett Brown to film this as well. In fact, actually, when Brown was asked to do The Shining, he had already committed to Rocky 2, and he told him, yeah, I'm interested in doing it, but I've got this commitment to Rocky 2, and they said, oh, no problem, we'll be done before then. And they weren't, because The Shining went so far over schedule. So The Shining actually had to pay Brown several times to fly him on the Concorde back and forth from the United Kingdom to America and back. And he worked on the two films simultaneously. And so it's the Shining, I guess, went many months over schedule. I don't know exactly what the original schedule was, but like I said, it was just under a year and a half that it took to film.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know how long to edit. I'm sure quite a few months at least. But anyway, though, so Danny, in a brilliantly shot scene, drives throughout the Overlook, and I mean, there's so many things like the sound effects. How he's driving over the carpet, and then it's really quiet, and then he drives over the, tile floor or whatever it is, and then you hear this really loud sound of the wheels,
And then it hits the carpet, and it's silence.
Yeah, there's so many things about that. I mean, even when I was a kid and didn't know anything about filmmaking, I thought that was impressive then. So then he turns a corner, and he sees, the Grady girls, and
on the third trip. Now, on the first two trips that he's riding his tricycle, you hear the eerie music and all that stuff, but nothing really happens.
Yeah, and then finally, he sees the Grady girls, and I once saw, I think it was on a YouTube clip of just that scene where somebody said, "Leave it to Stanley Kubrick to create the scariest scene in movie history using three children in a tricycle." So we all have our opinions. What's your opinion? Why is that scene so chilling?
Because it's like we finally figure out. The first time we meet the girls, it's in the vision.
Yeah.
And clearly it's part of a very bad vision.
Yeah.
Warning Danny, don't go to the Overlook Hotel. Tony
Yeah.
tells him, don't go to the Overlook Hotel. Well, why not? And so he shows him the vision.
Yeah.
Now, then the next time we see the girls, we see them in the games room.
Mm.
They don't say a word.
Yeah.
They just, and this time they're like in the flesh, so
Yeah.
to speak. But they're looking at him, he's looking at them. Nothing is said. Just this eerie music in the background. We have no idea what these girls want. Or who are they? Or
Yeah.
what the deal is. It's not until this moment when they finally speak. Hello, Danny. Come and play with us. Come and play with us, Danny. Forever and ever and ever.
And in between, we see these,
Corpses.
yeah, we see the horrifying shots of the girls who've been, killed with an axe, and for 1980 to show two girls, even though we don't actually see the act of them getting killed, just to show the aftermath, that was very, that was a very bold move for 1980.
It was the Grady twins.
Yeah.
It was at that moment.
Yeah.
Oh, those were the girls that Charles Grady killed.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, to me, one theory I've heard is that it's because we see them at the level of a child. Obviously the girls probably aren't very tall, but Danny's sitting on his tricycle. He saw them, where he saw them from straight ahead. So it would be more intimidating to a child. Someone who he's looking eye to eye rather than looking down far below on.
Right.
As an adult would, to the child. But aside from that, one theory I have is that I think the girls look almost pale and lifeless.
Because they are pale and lifeless.
Yeah. And then, another this person pointed out that they looked so forced, they're dressed the same way, it's all prim and proper. And so there's this sense of restraint that the girls have, that they've just, and of course, from what we see of their father lately, obviously he was a very tough disciplinarian, so.
I corrected them.
Yes. So, it could be that these girls have lived in this, really stifling environment, and
not unlike Danny.
Yeah, and so, and
so
of course,
will history repeat itself?
Yeah, and of course, when they say "come play with us, Danny," do they mean come, get killed here and be part of the family of ghosts here at the Overlook? We really don't know, but it's chilling nevertheless.
But it's possible.
Yeah. So anyway, then it's not long after that
that Tony says, he
Yeah.
closes his eyes
Yeah.
on the terror.
Yeah.
And it's really until the very end of the film
Yeah.
when he's being chased.
Yeah.
It's when he finally kind of loses himself to the terror.
Right.
He closes his eyes to the vision,
Yeah.
and then peeks out and sees that it's empty.
Yeah.
Again, once again, it's a vision that could easily be just in poor Danny's head.
It could be, yeah.
But then he goes to Tony and says, Tony, I'm scared. There's nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah.
Remember what Mr. Hallorann said. They're just like pictures in a book, Danny. It isn't real.
Yep. And then, it was really a very interesting scene. Shortly after that, Jack asks Wendy to, if he can go get his, what is it that he wanted to get?
His toy truck.
His toy truck, yeah. So he goes in, and she doesn't want him to do it because she thinks that his father's sleeping, and then she walks in and sees that he's awake, sitting up, frozen in bed, and then the two have a very awkward conversation in which he asks, his father, "Would you ever hurt me and mommy?"
Yeah. And then the music suddenly changes, like, uh-oh.
Yeah, and yeah, the music was really powerful in the film all the way. Both the original music by Wendy Carlos, and then the older classical pieces that were used as well. Is a lot of very eerie music in there. But it's interesting that Jack asks, did your mother say that?
Did your mother ever tell that to you?
Yeah.
That I would hurt you? No, Dad. Are you sure? Yes, Dad. I love you, Danny.
Yeah.
I would never hurt you. I wish we could stay here forever and ever and ever.
So,
just like the girls.
Yeah, exactly. And of course the thing is, it's really odd that it's one of the last times where Jack shows any traces of humanity there, where he does at least say that at least expresses his love to his son, even though he's not being very warm and tender about it.
Not being very honest about it.
Yeah, and then obviously ending with the same quote that Danny got from the girls.
Yeah.
And so, and then later you see Danny, playing, wearing his Apollo 11 shirt, which has spawned a lot of conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah,
but anyway, he's playing with these cars, and then you see a ball roll up to him from outside of 237. And earlier he had actually gone to 237 and almost went in, but decided not to.
On his second tricycle trip.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then this time he see, was the door open? Okay.
It was actually it was ajar, and the key to room 2, and that's how you knew that it was in fact room 237, because the key was actually in the lock. The door was ajar, but here's the thing about it. I mean, room 237 is supposed to be this god-awful room that you're not supposed to get into, but when you actually see for the first time the inside of room 237 at that moment, looks just like a nice hotel room.
Yeah, it does. And the thing, and of course, and should be noted in the book and in the miniseries, it was actually room 217, but Kubrick changed it to 237 for debatable reasons. But he said it was because the hotel in Oregon where they used the exterior shots has a room 217 and didn't want that associated with the film.
But since he did all the interior shots at I think it was Eltree Studios in England.
I don't remember the name of the studios.
Yeah, well, I think it was the same.
England, yeah.
Yeah, it was in England. I think it was the same one that they used to film much of the Star Wars films.
Okay.
That same area, but anyhow, the room is just a normal looking room, which again is why Kubrick's interpretation of horror is so fundamentally different from anything before or since, because when you look at horror before it, if there's a place like a haunted house, or
it looks creepy.
It looks creepy. It looks like, okay, something's going to happen here, something bad's going to happen here. But not the Overlook Hotel.
Yeah,
it's
sort of like
normal.
It's sort of like the view that some people have that Satan, if we saw Satan, that he would be, attractive looking,
Yeah.
And certain where it's a case of looks being deceiving, and
almost like the Overlook is wearing a mask itself.
Yeah, and it's interesting that even though it's such a pivotal moment in the film where Danny goes in there, we really don't know what ends up happening. Well, I mean, we get his account of it, but anyway, so then Wendy is, with attending to the boiler, and then she hears this horrifying, screaming, and
Jack has a nightmare.
Yeah, where he said that he not only killed Wendy and Danny, but cut them into little pieces, and this is the last time where you see any slight trace of decency in Jack, but it's quickly dashed when Danny walks in. After Wendy tries to comfort Jack, but then Danny walks in, having obviously been physically abused, even though we don't see the abuse take place.
Right.
And then of course she obviously naturally blames Jack because whether he did it or not, Wendy doesn't know that there's anybody in.
Well, of course not,
Yeah.
because I mean, allegedly it's just those three people
Yeah.
in the hotel.
And she knows that he's abused him before, so it's obviously a logical guess.
Mm-hmm.
So she accuses him, and it surprises me that she actually calls him a son of a bitch because she that seems a little too meek for her, but
But at the same time, within her character, it's like even at this moment when
Yeah.
she should be calling him every obscenity in the calendar.
yeah, yeah, she only calls
can't
him.
she can't bring herself up to go the full Monty
Yeah.
until the staircase scene.
Right, and so then I get a kick out of the scene where Jack's response to that is where he's walking down the hall going, "Ugh."
Yeah.
And it's really typical of Jack's dark humor in this movie, and then he walks into the gold room, and it's interesting that he's sitting there with all hunched over and talking about how much he wants a drink, saying that he'd give his soul for a glass of beer.
God, I want a drink. I'd sell my goddamn soul for just a glass of beer.
Yeah, and what I like is
And then Mephistopheles enters the room.
Yeah, and I love how Jack opens his eyes and he says, "Hi, Lloyd," and he starts talking to him, and then at first you just think it's Jack being funny, and then you actually see that he does see.
And then when he laughs after he says, "A
Yeah.
little slow tonight, isn't it?" and then
Yeah,
again, here's the thing about that particular moment.
yeah,
There's no music happening at this point. It's just Jack's voice going, "Hi, Lloyd," looking around. "A little slow tonight, isn't it?" And then cut immediately into Lloyd, the bartender, with booze all over behind him.
Yeah, and
No creepy music, nothing that says, okay, something's about to happen. No, you have no idea. All of a sudden, boom,
yeah,
there's a bartender with booze. What's going on?
yeah, and I remember the first time I saw that I was like, what's going on here, and now I just accept that as being a great part of the film. And what's interesting to me is that Jack doesn't freak out. It's like, oh no, I didn't see that. It's like he was expecting to see.
Almost like he was hoping for it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the way the two have this conversation, it seems that they know each other.
Which makes you wonder,
Yeah.
does he know him? And if so, when?
Yeah,
Where?
exactly. And of course, Lloyd, played by Joe Turkel, who actually just celebrated his 90th birthday.
Oh, he's still alive.
Yeah, celebrated his 90th birthday back on July 15th, and he's been retired from acting for probably about 20 years. But also, he also is well known for being in one of the other most analyzed movies of all time, Blade Runner, where he plays Turkel.
Turkel.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's another episode. That's another movie I want to do an episode on one of these days, because that's certainly a movie where there's a lot to say about as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And
you know that the Blade Runner 2049 is coming out.
oh yeah, I'm looking forward to that a lot. And
Yeah, I might actually go to the movie theater to watch that.
Oh, I will, and I want to see the original on a big screen one of these days.
Well, definitely see the director's cut if you're going to see the original. See
Oh,
the director's cut.
Oh, I've got the DVD of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because apparently that is, because I saw that and I definitely can understand why that they call that the definitive version.
Oh yeah,
Of what Blade Runner should be.
Oh, definitely, and so that's definitely look forward to seeing that, both the original and the sequel on the big screen. And I was glad they got Ridley Scott back to direct the new one too.
Yes.
But so anyway, Lloyd and Jack have this conversation, and Jack, it's like man, Lloyd basically is the sympathetic bartender who listens to his customers talk about their personal lives, and
Just a little problem with the old sperm bank
Yeah.
upstairs.
And-
Nothing I can't handle, Lloyd.
yeah, and I like Lloyd's response: "Women can't live with them, can't live without them."
Very cliched.
Yeah.
And told in a very cliched manner.
Yeah, and so Lloyd serves Jack drinks, and then
And you know what he serves him? Jack.
Oh, Jack Daniels.
Jack
okay,
Daniels.
yeah, I didn't. Pick
Serving
that up.
Jack.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then finally, Jack, eventually opens up and explains why, about his current problem.
Yeah, that incident.
And then that, obviously Wendy's just accused him of beating Danny, and Jack is of course denying it.
As long as I live, she'll never let me forget what happened. And it's at that point that he goes into this rant that I think is very key to what has happened before and what is about to happen later. I mean, yes, there is a supernatural element in all this, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, Jack has to do the deed.
Yeah.
Now, why would he do the deed? This is why. Because, well, I did hurt him once, okay? It was an accident. Completely unintentional. Could have happened to anybody. And it was 3 goddamn years ago! The little fucker threw all my papers all over the floor, and all I tried to do was pull them up! A momentary loss of muscular coordination. See this little extra little foot-pounds of energy per second.
And we don't know what Jack was going to go on to say, but that certainly he got it. Yeah, it was interesting to hear his side of things, and
right.
He's
the side of a man with a very short fuse.
Yeah, and of course someone who sees himself as a victim,
Right.
And
a man who can never take responsibility for his own actions. I mean,
yeah,
he broke Danny's arm.
Yeah.
Because his papers were all over the floor. Well, whoopie frickin' do.
Yeah, and there are parents who served time in prison for
doing a lot less.
Yeah. So, but anyway, then Jack.
But luckily for him, it was the late 1970s, so nothing to worry about there. Oh well, that's just husband and wife's business. Well, we're gonna go.
Yeah, they were pretty lax on domestic disputes.
Oh,
back
trust
in
me,
those days.
I know.
And of course, now we've gotten to the other extreme where now you have one, police called over some argument, and now you have social workers breathing down your neck. So
of course, yeah.
But anyway, then Wendy comes in, hysterically running into the bar room, and all of a sudden Lloyd and the alcohol are completely gone.
Which makes you think that maybe that's all in Jack's head.
Yeah.
Except when Wendy comes in and she, Jack, there's someone else here in the hotel. There's a crazy woman inside one of the rooms. And Jack looks at her, and if you notice, Jack looks drunk. Are you out of your fucking mind?
Yeah, and right after he's been talking to a ghost, he asks Wendy that question,
Well, which room was it? Again, he's acting drunk, but clearly there's no alcohol.
Yeah.
He hasn't drank any alcohol, but he's acting drunk.
Yeah, that's right. And so then, Wendy claims that there's a crazy woman in room 237 who tried to strangle Danny, so Jack goes to investigate. And then, there are a lot of interpretations of the scene, but, it's interesting to start off. I saw one assessment of that scene on I think it was on YouTube, and someone said that the carpet pattern in that room actually represents sexual intercourse. And the thing is, looking at it, I mean, I think it doesn't seem like it's that outlandish. A theory. I mean, it's not. I can't say definitively, but there's enough evidence there that
Well, the naked lady at the end
Well, yeah,
of the
but I'm talking about the carpet pattern, though.
Well, yeah.
But yeah.
But it's well, maybe it's a little bit of overanalyzing.
It could be, but so.
I mean, there was a heck of a lot of that in the documentary Room 237. 1977.
Oh yeah, as
I
well
mean-
as the Shining Code, and then the Shining Code 2.0, which
Yeah,
we'll talk.
I saw that too.
Yeah, which I'll mention that. I'll mention those a little bit at the end before we sign off.
Okay.
But you know, there's a lot of speculation about who the woman is. You know, for a long time I assumed it was Mrs. Grady.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense because we later see Mr. Grady. Of course, we see his daughters, and we know that he killed his wife too. So I just thought it was logical that it was Mrs. Grady. But then I learned that in the book and in the miniseries, of course, I saw in the miniseries that it said that there was a woman who had actually committed suicide in the bathtub previously.
By slitting her wrist.
Yeah, and of course because that woman, you know, is not mentioned. That incident isn't mentioned in the movie. We don't know if that's the woman or not. It could be simply Kubrick recontextualizing it, but,
Right.
which he's been known to do. But it's, you know, one theory I've seen about one theory I've read about the scene. Of course, Jack, you know, he sees the woman and who says nothing. But
Nothing is said
Yeah.
in that entire scene. Not a single line of dialogue.
Yeah.
Not a single word. It's all visual.
Yeah, so we see Jack embrace the naked woman who comes out of the bathtub, and they kiss. But then he looks in the mirror and sees that she's rotting in his arms, and you know, turns into this, you know, old, you know, decrepit, you know,
Corpse.
yeah, and who's, you know, wickedly laughing. And I love Jack's facial reaction when he's walking backwards like this, you know,
Like, oh my God.
And one of the most interesting assessments I've seen of that scene is, since we from what we gather, the preponderance of the evidence seems to be that Jack is part of the Overlook's past, and the Overlook is now trying to reclaim Jack and get him to be part of whatever, you know, that has to do with the
Yeah.
hotel. And, you know, what better way to divide him from his family than to get him to commit adultery? And so, you know, and of course, and then obviously, you know, I think one common interpretation is that, you know, when the woman rots in his arms and laughs at him, it's like, you know, we tricked you.
Yeah. Sucker.
And I think one thing that we see from the film, and I think this shows Kubrick having some insight into human nature, often people who are the biggest bullies are emotionally very weak. And what we see you know, throughout the film, more as it progresses, is that Jack is actually a mentally and emotionally weak person.
Yeah.
And he's very pliable, as we find out. And so Jack goes back to Wendy, you know, says that he saw nothing. And this, you know, Jack has so many classic lines, but one of my favorites comes from this scene. I think it's not as famous as Here's Johnny or some of the others, but basically after Jack, you know, he just shows he just coldly says that there's nothing there, and you know,
And basically explaining to Wendy that, you know, it's probably like what happened to him just before we left Denver to come here, basically.
yeah, Boulder actually, but yeah.
Boulder.
Yeah.
Boulder.
But yeah, it's basically Jack, you know, is trying to, you know, say that Danny is, you know, not telling the truth, and that, you know, he did these injuries to himself, and, you know, showing, you know, basically putting all the basically calling Danny a liar, which of course Jack knows that there actually is someone in that room, and then
But he's protecting her,
yeah, that's right,
which
and
makes you wonder.
yeah, protecting her instead of his son, and so
Protecting the hotel.
yeah, and so then Wendy, you know, says that regardless, she thinks they need to get out of here, and so
And
then,
that's when the turn comes.
yes, I love the line when Jack says, "I could write my own." Oh,
It's so fucking typical of you. You know, it's like from that point to the
Yeah.
end of the film,
Yeah.
there is no more humanity left in Jack.
Oh, yeah.
No fake smiles, nothing like that. Well, okay, I take that back. There's one more fake smile right after he kills Hallorann, but that's neither
Oh
here
yeah,
nor there.
yeah.
But
I
that
don't
was
know.
evil.
Yeah, I don't think that was a fake smile. I think he enjoyed doing it, but you know.
Yeah, he just became evil. But anyway, I mean, he just, from that point on, it's like, okay, screw you.
Yeah.
No more hiding, no more pretending. I'm sick of both of y'all.
Yeah.
But he doesn't do anything. He just storms out of the room.
Yeah, well, I like some of his lines though, like, like he's accusing Wendy of trying to take him away, from the Overlook when he finally has a chance to make something out of himself when he's into his work, and then I'm thinking, yeah, that book you were working on is really going to be a bestseller.
All Work and No Play makes Jack a Dull Boy by Jack Torrance.
And there actually is a book on the market with that title. And it's actually 237 pages of that sentence over and over.
Oh my God! The Stanley Kubrick estate should have sued them.
Oh yeah, but
no, it would have to be Stephen King because.
Was that line in the book? All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Yes.
Okay. That was the book he had been working. He had been working on a book that was that sentence.
All work and no play makes Jack a dull. Now, of course, in Stephen King's book,
Yeah.
I mean, it just a few lines of it, and just to give you an idea that every page is the same thing.
Yeah.
But the way Stanley Kubrick did it, though, was brilliant.
Yeah. And I'll say this for when we get to that scene, but I loved the line, when he said, "I could write my own ticket if I went back to Boulder now, couldn't I?"
Shoving up driveways, working a car wash. Would that appeal to you, Jack? And poor Wendy, I swear, she was perfect
Oh yeah.
for the abused wife. And that's basically
yeah.
what Wendy Torrance is. She's an abused wife.
Oh yeah.
She
yeah.
is an emotionally and possibly physically abused wife.
Oh yeah. She's obviously a doormat for her husband, and then finally,
Wendy, I've let you fuck up my life so far, but I'm not gonna let you fuck this up.
Yeah, and
then he just storms out the door.
Yeah, and previously when he was walking down the hall, he was going, and this time he's like knocking stuff off, the shelves.
Right.
And then he walks into the gold room again. This time it's filled with hundreds of ghosts for some ball, and he goes back and has another visit to Lloyd. And
maybe a 4th of July ball, perhaps.
Yeah, we don't know for sure, but it's a very festive occasion. It looks like from the 20s or 30s, and
maybe 1921, perhaps.
Yeah, although the song they're playing, "Midnight, the Stars and You," is actually from 1932, but yeah, so maybe there was a combination of different eras, but anyway.
All times are one. Which in the book, basically, the way that this particular scene is handled in the book, the characters, the ghosts, are from different time eras of the hotel.
Right.
Not just 1920s and 30s, but also 1890s, 1900s, even 1940s. I mean, just all times are one.
Okay, yeah, that's that I didn't know that, but it's certainly it's a brilliantly shot scene. It's the only large crowd scene of the whole movie. Most of the movie there's only a few people on.
Right.
There's no more than a few people on screen at once.
The hotel reveals itself completely,
Yeah.
openly, for the first time.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Jack walks in and the host says, "Good evening, Mr. Torrance." And
Good evening.
Yeah, and
Again, no ill reaction. He's just like he
Yeah.
fully expects.
Yeah, and so he goes and orders another drink from Lloyd, who won't take Jack's money. What do you think the significance of that is?
There was actually a thing on YouTube about that particular.
Was it from Rob Ager?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that the significance, and he did a close up on that bill, and sure enough, it's well, the significance, what he believes is that it's representative of the U.S. monetary system. The fact
Yeah.
that he wants to give him a U.S. note.
Yeah.
And Lloyd, your money's no good here.
Yeah. Yeah, and so yeah.
Orders from the house.
Yeah.
Well, I'm the kind of man that wants to know who's buying his drinks. And then Lloyd says, "That's not a matter that concerns you, Mr. Torrance. Not at this moment."
Yeah, I've never really understood the significance of that. Rob Akers certainly has a very elaborate explanation, which could be completely false, but certainly it's interesting.
It is very interesting, and and as for him and his analysis, I love his analysis of Stanley Kubrick's works. I mean, he really does a fantastic job. I think I think he should have been in the Room 237
Oh
documentary.
yeah, and
He would have added a lot more intellectual character
Oh.
than some of the stuff that was
Oh,
filed out.
I agree. I think some of his, even though I don't necessarily agree with his assessments, I think they're more interesting than some of what was in Room 237. Although I did enjoy that film as well.
I enjoyed Room 237 not so much as a serious documentary as just sort of a, just watching how other people interpret The Shining.
Oh, I think it's fascinating, yeah. And but what about the line where Lloyd says, it's not when Jack says, "I'm the kind of man who likes to know who's buying his drink," and Lloyd says, "It's not a matter that concerns you, at least not at this point." Do you have any speculation as to what that means?
Well, if you look at it from just an objective point of view, it's like he's talking to a ghost.
Yeah,
Of course, the ghost is not going to accept his money.
yeah.
He's a ghost. But what interested me was the fact that Jack wanted to know who was in charge, who was the man buying the drinks. Basically, who was the master of ceremonies. And Lloyd refuses to tell him.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I see. That's a good assessment. But-
And it makes you wonder. And again, it makes me wonder. I compared Lloyd the bartender to Mephistopheles because Jack was willing to sell his soul for a glass of beer.
Yeah.
and
Oh, that's a good point.
boom.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it made me wonder when I saw that in later years, was Lloyd basically Mephistopheles and the Overlook Hotel basically the entrance to hell?
Yeah, I mean that's a good assessment, and that I never put the two and two together as far as the timing where Jack says he would sell his soul for the beer, and then all of a sudden Lloyd shows up,
With all kinds of
and I have seen it written before that Lloyd represents the devil. I have seen people say that before.
I'm not so sure about that. I think if you're going into Judeo-Christian
Yeah.
philosophy on that, I think he's more Mephistopheles
Oh, okay.
than Satan because he won't tell. Well, mainly because Jack asked him, "Well, who's buying the drinks?"
Oh, okay.
And
yeah.
Lloyd won't tell him. Now, of course, if he was Satan,
Yeah.
why would he have any problem telling him that he was the one buying? He's the
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah.
But he doesn't want Jack to know just yet the trap that has been set for him by the hotel.
Yeah.
Not yet.
But then Jack gets up. He's in a festive mood. He's in a much more festive mood than he was the last time he was there.
Anything you say, Lloyd. Anything you say.
So he gets
Get
up-
that drink.
And he gets up and takes he starts walking around the barroom, and then a butler, and what looked like it was rather intentional to me, spills bourbon and advocaat on Jack.
Ah.
And it's interesting, advocaat, I looked it up, it's actually a Dutch word. It's Advocaat, and it actually means lawyer, which is an odd choice for the name of an alcoholic beverage, but
Huh.
anyway, I mean, can you imagine in America going to a bar saying, "Hey, give me a bottle of lawyer," but anyway, though, so then
No, but I got plenty of Jack.
and so anyway, the bartender, he pretends to be apologetic and takes Jack into the restroom to clean him off, and then the two, at first the bartender's acting like a very humble servant, and he's, as a British accent, very prim and proper, and then Jack asks him his name, and he...
What do they call you here around? What do they call you around here, Jeezy?
Yeah,
Grady, sir. Delbert Grady.
yeah, and so, it's interesting that, Jack, I like how Jack, he goes, "Grady? Yes, sir. Delbert Grady?" the way Jack repeats it to make sure that he understands it correctly. And, then the conversation reveals that Grady was indeed the caretaker who had previously murdered his family.
Under the name Charles Grady.
Yeah, and, there are several possibilities. One is that it could be that Barry Nelson, when reciting the line, simply made a mistake, and then it somehow passed to editing. We don't know.
But unfortunately, well, see, here's the thing. No, the reason why a lot of people don't believe that is because we're talking. Any other director, we're talking a continuity error.
Right.
But we're talking about Stanley Kubrick here.
Yeah, and of course another thing we know
that would not have gone past him.
Probably not. Yeah. As much attention as he paid to detail. I mean, the fact that he supposedly got in there in the pantry and specifically lined up the tin cans certain ways.
Right.
But yeah, that was
for maximum color, as it turned out.
Okay.
According to one of his assistants.
Yeah, and Kubrick, it should be noted, supposedly had an IQ of 200, and he was almost certainly autistic. They didn't have a lot of diagnosis when he was growing up, but he had every symptom, the extreme obsessiveness, extreme attention to detail.
He was a chess master.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it's Grady, obviously, Kubrick, obviously, chess, probably every major chess player ever has been autistic, at least to some level, just because of the very nature of the game, because it's just so mental.
Oh, yes.
Well, it's completely mental, in fact.
Well, yes.
But anyway, though, so Grady, so I'll tell you, I saw one very astute comment on YouTube of the bathroom scene between Jack and Grady, where somebody talked about Philip Stone, the British stage actor who played Grady, doing a masterful job at transforming from humble servant to ruthless killer when Jack mentions Grady's murderous past. That at first, Grady's very apologetic for spilling the bourbon and avocado on Jack, is being very, humble, trying to help him clean up, but all of a sudden Jack mentions, that Grady is, you chopped your wife and daughter into little bits, then you blew your brains out. And then, Grady, he does this really subtle change. You have to pay attention to it, because he's speaking the same tone of voice, but then you can see that he totally changes. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that at first, he's denying having done that, says that he has no recollection of that at all.
Mr. Grady, you were the caretaker. I'm sorry to differ with you, sir, but you are the caretaker. You have always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
So what's the significance of the line, "You've always been the caretaker"?
Well, interestingly enough, when, and again, we're dealing with the picture at the very end, but when Stanley Kubrick was interviewed soon after the film was released, he mentioned that the significance of the picture at the end was that Jack is a reincarnation of a previous, now the way he said it was, a previous caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. But he doesn't identify which one.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if he's actually the reincarnation of all the caretakers.
Oh, we don't know. Yeah, that's certainly an interesting theory. And but that does that mean also that Grady, that Delbert Grady, later reincarnated as Charles Grady, and that the two, in their various lives, both became caretakers over the Overlook?
Well, the problem with that, though, and the reason why I don't 100% accept that possibility, I think more he might have been a reincarnation of the caretaker from 1921.
Okay.
That is pictured, but I don't think he was the reincarnation of Charles Grady, the man who murdered his wife and two kids, because it happened in 1970.
Yeah.
Ullman gives a specific date for that,
Yeah,
and
that's true.
unfortunately, Jack Torrance would have been alive.
Oh yes, yes. But do you think that Delbert and Charles are two different people who are like, or maybe one was a reincarnator of the other? They were both at different times in their lives, in different lives at the Overlook.
It's very possible. What we could be dealing with is basically just that bad things has happened in the Overlook Hotel over the years. As Hallorann told Danny, and each time a bad thing happened, it leaves a trace of itself. And unfortunately, you have Delbert Grady leaving a trace that we see later in the film.
Yeah.
Although in the film he sounds like he is the hotel. I've always been here.
Yeah.
It's almost as if I am the one who's buying the drinks.
Yeah.
I am the hotel. I am the Overlook. You have always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
Yeah, and then of course then he goes into the line where he informs Jack that an outside party is that his son is trying to bring an outside party into this situation. We forgot to mention the scene where Danny channels to Hallorann, which we'll get to in a second. But,
Right.
Anyway, though, so Grady tells Jack that Danny is trying to bring an outside party into the situation,
And we can forego the particular word that he uses for that gentleman, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting that Jack asks who it is, and it's interesting that Grady simply says he's an African American, except he uses
an N-word.
Yeah, and so is Kubrick trying to tell us that these ghosts are so vile they're even racists?
Well, I'm sure that's. I'm pretty sure that's exactly what. I mean, we're dealing with evil characters here.
Yeah.
He's trying to depict evil.
Yeah, and then of course another
white man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
And then of course you also have where these people. I mean, this is somebody who's like a guy with a British accent, obviously very prim and proper. Someone who's a big snob, and the type of person who, especially at that era, would have looked down at black people,
right,
and seen them that way.
I mean, he would have had no problem, calling a person, someone like that, the N-word,
right,
an N-word.
Yeah, and of course it's interesting that Jack repeats it, and doesn't seem to be offended.
But you notice that when he repeats it all in kind of a southern accent.
Yeah,
a Negro?
Yeah. I never thought about this.
That's not the word. I mean, it's
right.
the other N-word, but
I never thought about it as being, southern.
But listen to that. When Jack repeats that, and the way he repeats it, it's almost like a southern accent. Like a nigger.
Yeah. And then
a N-word cook.
Yeah.
Like just sort of like not just any old black guy, but a black cook.
Yeah, and then I like that Jack is astonished, like how?
Your son has a great talent. I don't think you know how great that talent is. Well,
now he's trying to use the talent against your will.
Yeah. Well, he's a very willful boy.
Yeah.
A very willful boy. A rather naughty boy, if I may be so bold.
It's his mother. She interferes.
Man.
And then he says, perhaps they need a good talking to, perhaps a bit more if you don't mind my saying so. My girls, sir, didn't care for the Overlook at first. One of them actually stole a pack of matches and tried to burn it down, but I corrected them, sir. And when my wife tried to prevent me from doing my duty, I corrected her. And so... And I've often used that phrase "corrected" with my kids. When they're misbehaving, I tell them I'm going to correct them in my best attempt at an English accent, which isn't very good, but I try at least. But
I'm amazed your kids understood the where it came from.
Yeah, well, they didn't at first, and then my daughter, when she was 10, I let her see The Shining. She'd heard me talk about it so much she wanted to see it, and I thought, what the heck? I was 10 the first time I saw it, so
Why not?
Yeah, I mean, she watched it in my presence. What was really odd is that I was totally freaked out the first time I saw it. I couldn't go to bed after I saw it. She wasn't disturbed at all. Kids these days,
Because they're so used to horror in ways that was new to was starting to be there.
Yeah.
Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Alien, but it's still new and fresh. But nowadays,
yeah, oh yeah, and so anyway, and you see that Grady, is a very strong-willed person, and he's basically using peer pressure to try to intimidate Jack into, basically into killing his family.
right,
And
repeating what happened.
and we get this impression that Jack wants to get the approval of Grady and maybe the hotel in general.
He wants to return to the hotel.
Yeah, and of course we saw. Was it during the scene where? I'm trying to remember when Danny called out to when Danny called to Hallorann. I think it was the scene where Jack had just gotten back and said that there was nothing in room 237.
Actually, he was calling. Mr. Hallorann. No, he was calling him when Jack was in room 237.
Okay.
Because it would intercut between
okay.
him and the corpse woman.
Yeah.
And Danny and Dick Hallorann looking at each other like, oh my God, what? They're in trouble. They're in trouble.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I remember the first time the first time the movie cut, which was a little bit earlier, when the movie cuts to Hallorann in his Miami apartment. First, the screen is filled with a TV news channel. My brother said the first time he saw it, he thought that the channel had gotten changed. Where it switches to that Miami newscast.
Yeah.
And it's very well done, and maybe Kubrick was trying to play with people's minds with that.
Yeah, it was right after Jack tells, which room was it? And then,
Okay.
boom.
Okay.
You get into that.
But it's interesting that you look at where Hallorann, he's we see Hallorann lying there in bed, with that tense look on his face, and you see it's interesting that both in front of him and behind him there. I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's a picture of a nude woman in both places.
With a fro like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, well, it was
the 70s.
Yep, yeah, when it was, that's right, it was filmed in the late 70s, yeah.
Yep.
And, it was a very, very big fro even for that era, especially for a woman.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's lying there in his pajamas, and, he feels, being called by Danny, and then, so he makes his way up there to the overlook, and by the way, did you recognize the actor who played Larry Durkin, the garage owner who set Hallorann up with the snowcat?
No.
Okay. His name is Tony Burton, who's best known probably for the Rocky movies. He's the black bald guy who played Apollo Creed's trainer.
Oh.
And then, and he and Sylvester Stallone and Burt Young are the only three actors who are in each of the first 6 Rocky movies. Because, then, he later became Rocky's trainer in the later sequels. So yeah, he's, that was, and he actually, and you remember in Rocky 4, Tony Burton, his character Duke, was playing chess with that Russian guy. I don't know, do you remember?
Yeah,
that
I
scene?
remember.
Yeah, and anyway, it turns out that was put in the movie because Tony Burton is a real life chess player, and he and Kubrick actually played chess with each other on the set of the movie. And according to Garrett Brown on the audio commentary on the DVD, Burton beat Kubrick once and felt it was a sheer triumph because Kubrick was so good.
I'm sure Kubrick. I'm sure Kubrick was like, I lost.
Yeah, I guess, because if he was a grandmaster, then
Well, I don't think he was ever named a grandmaster or anything. I mean, I don't think he ever competed.
I don't know if he did or not, but Garrett Brown actually said in the audio commentary though that he believes that Kubrick was a grandmaster. I'll have to look it up to confirm.
Yeah, I mean, because I've never heard of him actually doing any competitions or anything.
Yeah, I'll have to look that
But
up.
he definitely had a reputation of being a very good chess player.
Yeah, which anybody with his level of intelligence would be.
Yeah.
But anyway, though, so there's another thing. I don't know if you have seen. I saw this in a YouTube video as well. But anyway, so Hallorann flies up from Miami to Denver, rents a car at the airport. Drives out to this garage where Larry Durkin, the Tony Burton character, sets Hallorann up with a snowcat. Actually, yeah, and then but wait, when he's on his way to the garage though, he drives past an accident scene where you see that a truck has just crushed a
red Volkswagen Beetle.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, in the book, that's what Jack drove.
Yes.
And some people believe it was a subtle jab of saying, out of the way, King. This is my movie.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, though, so Jack, after the conversation with Grady, then he becomes more aggressive. He goes and disables the radio, so cutting off any communication that the Overlook has with the outside world. When that forest ranger or whatever is calling at Hallorann's request, and then Jack, rather than answering, he just disables the radio.
Takes out some crystals from inside the radio.
Yep, and then he disables the snowcat there.
That we later learn when he...
And then he goes back to typing his masterpiece of a book.
All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Yep. And so then, what's interesting is that Wendy, she's sitting there, smoking. She's standing there, pacing back and forth nervously, smoking a cigarette, and she's actually talking to herself about what they need to do. And even saying that they'll leave without
leave without Jack, take the snowcat.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, you have no idea.
Yep. So anyway, Wendy says she's going to go back tells Danny she's going to go talk to her father, talk back to his father, and while he's watching a Bugs Bunny cartoon or Roadrunner cartoon.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any particular significance to that, except that it's it was a Warner Brothers movie and it's a Warner Brothers cartoon.
Right.
Some people have tried to put conspiracy theories into that as well.
Oh, but I'm sure that that's exactly what it is. It's a Warner Brothers cartoon on a Warner Brothers movie.
Yeah, I think so too, and certainly typical of what the kid that age would watch.
Right.
At that time, back when they still had Saturday morning cartoons.
And I was watching that too.
Oh, I did. I
Yeah.
was too. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And it's interesting that she tells Danny to lock. She tells Danny to keep the door locked because she obviously knows that something's wrong with Jack, and of course she takes a baseball bat with her.
Yeah.
And so anyway, finally.
So all pretense is basically all pretense is finally gone.
Yeah. And so Wendy, she goes down and looks at the book, and I love she sees the first page. It's all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and then the second page is the same thing, and I love how she gets like really hysterical, flipping,
I know.
One page after another, where you just see that she's totally, she wasn't expecting this at all, and that's when she realizes her husband has completely lost it.
How you like it?
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah. How do you like it? Yeah. That was his phrase.
Just an innocuous phrase right there.
And
it horrifies the crap out of her.
Yeah. And then Jack is being totally sarcastic here. And he sees how scared Wendy is, and he's preying on her fear. It's like, I wanted to talk to you. Okay.
Let's talk.
What do you want to talk about? And then they have a I love how the way the conversation builds up. It's like, when she says she wants to talk about Danny, or no, when she says she doesn't remember what they wanted to talk about, and he suggests it was about Danny.
I think it's about Danny? I think it's about him. I think we should talk about Danny.
And finally he pulls out of her that that maybe he should be taken to a doctor. You think maybe he should be taken to a doctor.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again,
Yeah.
all sarcasm,
Yeah.
all menacing.
And then when she says yes, it's like, when do you think maybe he should be taken to a doctor?
As soon as possible. As soon as possible.
Yeah, and then after she confirms that she's concerned about him, and then Jack asks, "Well, are you concerned about me?" And then he goes on this long tirade. Have you ever thought about my responsibilities to my employer? And
Have you ever had any single moment's thought about my responsibilities to my employers?
Yeah, and then he gets angrier and angrier, talking about his obligations that he's agreed to.
A contract.
And there's actually a T-shirt of Jack making this fist where he goes, a contract. and it's hilarious. I'm thinking about adding that to my repertoire. But anyway, though, then finally he advances at her, and then she starts swinging the baseball bat. You notice how much she's choked up on it? She's just going like
yeah,
this.
like she has definitely never played baseball or softball or any kind of ball with any kind of bat ever.
Yeah, and so then the scene where they did 127 takes.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Yeah.
Bash them right the fuck in.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I love how he follows her up the steps, and she keeps swinging the bat, and he's challenging her.
Give me the bat.
And he calls her light of my life. He calls her light of my life at one point.
Yeah, Wendy, sweetheart, light of my life.
And
I'm not gonna hurt you.
One of my favorite lines is
I'm just gonna bash your brains.
And one of my favorite lines that Jack says is, "Do you have the slightest idea what a moral and ethical principle is?"
Do you?
Yeah, when he's trying to kill his family, he's asking her what a moral and ethical principle is.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane. This is what happens when a man finally loses it.
Yeah.
Completely.
And then finally they get near the top, and then Jack's arrogance gets the best of him. He sticks his hand out a little too far, and finally Wendy hits him on the hand and then in the head, and then he comes tumbling
God
down.
Damn it! And then she, boom.
Yeah. And I wasn't sure she had it in her, but she did.
Finally.
And then she drags him into the pantry, locks him in, and he's just regaining consciousness while she's about to finish the job. And what's interesting is when he demands that she lets him out, and then assures her that it'll be like nothing ever happened, you'll forget the whole thing. I mean, did he really expect her to believe that?
Well, even if you look at his face, he kind of, it'll be just like nothing ever happened, and then he kind of looks like, what's he buying?
And what's really interesting is the camera angle that it's done from below,
And Stanley Kubrick is on the camera filming up. The cameraman for that particular scene in there was Stanley Kubrick.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that, but yeah, it was a really interesting shot. And then, what's really interesting is that of course, Wendy says that she's going to get a doctor, and she'll bring a doctor back to Jack,
and then Jack's like, "No, you're not, Wendy, you're not going anywhere. Go check out the Snowcat in the radio, and you'll see what I mean."
So of course she does check it out, obviously, and sees that that she's stranded in there, and meanwhile Jack hears a knock on the door and thinks it's Wendy, but it's actually Grady. And this is an example I use of Jack's mental weakness, that Grady is talking down to Jack for having not attended to the business that was discussed, and Jack is so desperate to impress Grady, and especially when Grady keeps on expressing doubts in Jack having the stomach for it, as Grady puts it. And finally he guarantees that he will,
And it's at this moment right here, when even up to all the other, there are supernatural things that go on.
Yeah.
But even all the supernatural things that happen, even what happens in room 237, even with Danny having the bruises on his neck, everything up until this moment that we're about to get to they all have a seemingly innocent explanation. Mainly is that you got Danny's overactive imagination or Jack's losing his mind.
Yeah.
And clearly at this point Jack is losing his mind. But when he is talking to Grady, you think that, it could be just all in Jack's head, but then it happens. The door is unlatched.
Right.
Now, how in the hell could that happen?
Yeah.
It's this moment when a supernatural thing that has no explanation whatsoever, it's a supernatural thing. The hotel comes to life.
Right, and all the while Danny is starting to chant red rum, red rum, red rum, which he chants. He speaks the word 43 times, by the way.
Oh, you counted.
No, I didn't. I read it.
Oh, wow.
But he speaks it 43 times, and it becomes more menacing as he says it over and over, in Tony's voice.
Right.
And then he writes it with his mother's lipstick on the door, in their in the guest quarters there.
Right.
And then Wendy wakes up, and then sees the reflection in the mirror where it says murder. And it's interesting, my brother was 9 years old, and he figured out that it said murder backwards, before the movie reveals that. So he's a pretty perceptive little kid.
So he must have figured red rum. Well, that's an unusual name. What if I say it backwards?
Right.
M-U... Oh, murder!
You're right, yeah. And so anyway, and then and of course Danny was holding the knife, which made it even, for seeing a kid that age holding a knife like that, it looks pretty creepy,
Well, yeah.
And
I mean, she's panicking at that point, and then at that moment, of course, when she takes the knife away and the lipstick, and she sees the mirror image, and realizes that what he was saying is murder backwards, and at that exact moment when she realizes this, in comes Jack to pay him a visit.
Yeah, and he chops through the first door, and the funny thing is, they actually used a fake door in the beginning, but it turned out that Jack was actually a trained firefighter, so he knew how to use an axe real well, and he chopped through it so easily, so they finally decided to use real doors. And so he chops through one, then then the second one where Wendy is, and of course Wendy opens the window to get, and Danny, she gets it open enough so that Danny can slide out there to safety, but she can't fit through herself. So he thinks that she's bracing herself for death, but then when Jack makes the hole in the door, and
just that whole scene of Jack bashing through the door with the axe, and the look on Shelley Duvall's face.
Oh yeah, it was very powerful.
There is nothing fake about. I mean, of course it's fake.
Yeah.
We know it's fake, but you look at that. Of all the horror films that you see, a lot of them look fake. There's a fakeness to it, but when you see that, the look on Shelley Duvall's face as the axe keeps going down, over and over and over, and the hole is getting wider and wider. She is scared out of her mind, and she looks it.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously Kubrick had done a masterful job psychologically conditioning her,
to that moment.
Yeah, and I would guess, one thing that I don't think a lot of people who don't work in film, I don't think a lot of people who don't work in film realize that most of the time, the scenes of a movie were not shot in the order that you see them in. There's a lot of reasons for that. That's a whole different story for that could go on for a long time talking about. But it's very rare that scenes are shot in order. There are a very few exceptions for special reasons, but I would guess that was shot near the end. That particular scene, after Shelley Duvall was probably broken down, and probably a lot of the scenes that weren't so bad were shot earlier on, where that didn't require as much emotional trauma. But yeah, and then in one of the most famous unscripted lines in movie history, Jack says, "Here's Johnny." And what's interesting is that Stanley Kubrick, though he was American, he had lived in the United Kingdom for a long time at that point and had never seen The Tonight Show, so he did not get the joke. Um, when Jack said, "Here's Johnny," he didn't know what it was a reference to.
And I actually remember
Yeah.
all those years ago when the Tonight Show actually opened with that scene, just so
Okay.
Jack Nicholson can go, "Here's Johnny,"
Yeah.
and then da 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 da
I
da da da.
I'll have to look to see if that's on YouTube. That'd be fun to see. But
Yeah, I would love to see that again too.
yeah, it
But I
probably is.
distinctly remember seeing that.
Yeah, and I wonder how many of the younger people who see The Shining now get the joke. You know,
That's a good question.
because Johnny Carson, it's hard to believe he's been off the air 25 years now.
Wow, yeah.
And
Just showing our age there.
yeah, that's right. We were both 19 when we met down the hall 27 years ago. Both 46 now. But
Yeah.
But anyway, though, so then you think Wendy's doomed, but showing more resourcefulness than than we gave her credit for. When Jack sticks his hand through, she slashes it with a knife, and so Jack's now he's got a baseball bat to the hand, one to the head, and now a gash to the hand. So Wendy was tougher than we expected, and so anyway, then Jack walks out of that area, and meanwhile Hallorann arrives, and Jack hears him calling out to ask if anybody's there, and then meanwhile Danny is hiding inside. He's made his way back into the hotel. He's hiding in one of the cabinets or whatever you call it.
Yeah, one of the near the kitchen.
Yeah.
In obviously where they would keep kitchen items like bowls and things, and pots. Just before we go any further,
Yeah.
one big difference from the book to the film
Yeah.
is that in the book and the miniseries
Yeah.
based on the book, instead of an axe, he uses
Croquet mallet.
a croquet mallet.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that was in the miniseries too.
Right.
And I remember seeing the miniseries and thinking, after Kubrick ups the weapon to an axe, it just doesn't seem as scary when you go back to the croquet mallet.
And what's more, it's like when he gets through the door, it sticks his face in there and goes, boom.
Yeah, exactly. It's just after Kubrick. I mean, I like the miniseries. I think there's a lot of good in it, and I think people need to, when people watch it, they need to forget about the Kubrick version while they're watching the miniseries.
And just think about the book.
Yeah, but it's just after Kubrick had upped the ante, and then you go back to the croquet mallet, it just isn't as intimidating.
And boo.
Yeah.
like
Oh yeah. So
nah.
so anyway, then while Danny's hiding and Hallorann is walking, through through the hotel looking for somebody, then Kubrick scares you the good old-fashioned way when Jack jumps up from around the corner, and I literally jumped the first time I saw it because I had no idea it was going to happen.
And this is the first and only time we actually see a killing.
Yeah.
This is about as close to a blood and gore horror, more traditional horror film, is when Hallorann is murdered.
Yeah.
Now in the book, he's hit with a croquet mallet and actually survives.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And he's in it the movie so you see he's still alive at the end.
Right.
And
But in Kubrick's version,
Yeah.
Hallorann is killed.
and Kubrick said he had that done because he felt Jack needed to kill somebody. So
And because he couldn't kill Wendy or Danny.
yeah, Hallorann was the odd man out.
Sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, I literally jumped, and that's the way movies used to scare people, by surprising them like that. And
Yeah, and even the lead up into, Hallorann gets out of his snowcat, walks into the building.
Yeah.
There's no creepy music. There's nothing suspenseful that tells you, okay, he's about to get killed.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, hello, and the echoes
Yeah.
throughout. He's just walking in there in the semi-darkness. Anybody here? Just keeps walking, and all you hear is the sound of the wind outside and his footsteps on the floor.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all you hear. It's not until Jack steps out, goes ah, and then whack into his chest, and then you hear the music.
Oh yeah.
It's a shock.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's chilling, that it's straight to the heart, and then he falls over, and I mean, as from a gore standpoint, I've seen far worse, but it's just it's all done it's so well filmed, and then
most importantly, it feels real.
Yeah, and like I said, it's just that it's so unexpected. I mean, it really makes you jump, and I think it probably especially freaked out the people who had read the book first, since Hallorann survives in the book.
And then all of a sudden, it's like he kills him.
Yeah. So anyway, then that's Danny. Obviously realizes it's happened, and then he gets out. Of the place he's hiding,
And just after he kills Hallorann, he hears Danny screaming because
yeah.
he's now connected with Hallorann, and as Hallorann is dying, he's in pain.
Oh yeah.
And he's screaming, and then Jack hears him, and at first you don't see anything. You just see like sort of a blurry background, but then Jack rises his head above from below the screen line, and just the look on his face.
Oh yeah, it's chilling, and by that point he's been unshaven for a long time, and you could you could see how evil he's become, that he enjoyed what he just did.
Danny!
Yeah.
Danny boy!
And so then he chases Danny through the maze, and of course Danny, apparently has the whole maze memorized, and then meanwhile, Wendy, comes out of the guest quarters and starts looking around the hotel, and then she sees, a lot of visions, including,
she finally sees the Overlook for what it is.
Now, explain to the viewers, and you understand it better, explain the man in the dog costume that Wendy sees.
Well,
in a way that's suitable for this webcast, of course.
Well, that's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
Let's just say that, in the book, there's a man that Jack sees in the gold room.
Yeah.
It's a costume ball.
Horace Derwent.
I think that's his name. But anyway, he'd
been a former owner of the Overlook.
And he is apparently a homosexual.
Yes.
So he's wearing a dog outfit, trying to get someone to have sex with him.
Yeah, and the character Horace Derwent was mentioned. Well, he was a character in the miniseries, but because it was made for ABC, they strongly toned down the content.
Right.
They kept it down to PG-13 level.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest problems with the miniseries, even though I like it overall, is that it was made for ABC. If they were going to make it for TV, they should have made it for cable, so they wouldn't have been so restricted in the content.
They could have made it an appropriate R rating, which, I mean, the book is
of course
very R rated.
Yeah, no question about it. But anyway, though, so Wendy sees that, and then she sees that guy, who says "great party," isn't it? Who?
Yeah.
I don't know if he was supposed to be,
when I first saw that, I thought that was what Grady looked like after he blew his brains out.
Yeah, because that's what it looks. That's why I got the impression that this guy had shot himself. But,
yeah.
Yeah. So maybe that's what it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also see the scene where she goes in where there are all these skeletons and cobwebs, and that's where it looks like like a haunted house.
Yeah, for the first and only time, it looks like what you expect in a horror film. I mean, Now you see the cliches coming.
Yeah, but then of course anything but cliche. Finally, you see, to top it off, Wendy experiences that vision that Danny had with the blood coming out of the elevator.
Right.
Which is, I think, one of the most, to this day, 37 years later, one of the most chilling scenes ever shown. And it was just masterfully put together, even more so when you consider how limited the resources were back then compared to today.
Right.
When they actually had to do it, where they had to set up everything like that, and they had to, get all that, water that, had the appearance of blood, and obviously an extremely large quantity.
And do it again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah, and the thing with Kubrick, supposedly, like this like in the staircase scene, and I think a lot of times when he did dozens and hundreds of takes, he didn't give any instruction. Supposedly he was just looking for the perfect shot. He couldn't explain it. He would just know it when he saw it. And so glad he finally did see it. But yeah, it's a magnificent scene. And then and I still remember how it affected me when I was a kid and I saw it. I mean, like I said, I couldn't go to bed after I saw it when I was a kid. It really traumatized me that much. And I always say, you've succeeded as a filmmaker when you get the audience to react the way you try to get the audience to react. Whether that's fear or, laughter or any emotion. If you successfully get that, reaction that you're going for, you've done your job.
Right.
Like I used the example in Rocky IV when Rocky knocks out Drago in the last round. When I saw it in the theater, the audience literally erupted in cheering like it was a real sporting event.
And that happened to me too when I first saw that film. And ironically, I first saw Rocky IV I was in Naval Junior ROTC in high school, and we was having a field day exercise with several other units in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
And we was in I believe it was Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
And it was at a theater, and our naval science instructor, Commander William Miller, treated us to a film.
Yeah.
And Rocky IV, seemed to be this, appropriate film for us to watch. And even there, with the people that I was at, I mean, it was patriotism, Cold War propaganda, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, I mean, Sylvester Stallone with that movie did a magnificent job of, putting Rocky into the Cold War,
and winning.
Yeah. And he knew what buttons to push with the audience with that movie. And as I say in my episode with Michelle Gusso on that movie, it's not the deepest film in the series, but considering considering the era in which it was made, he did a great job making a Rocky movie for that era.
I actually liked it. I mean,
I love it. Yeah.
I mean, it's true. It's easy to look back on it and think. I mean, of course, the first Rocky, artistically, was a great film.
Yeah, but
absolutely.
But still with Rocky IV, what Stallone did was he brought the Rocky series into the trends of 1985,
right,
and did a masterful job at it. But as for The Shining, so after Wendy sees the blood, she finds her way out, and meanwhile Danny is backtracked in the snow, and then jumped off of the track. So Jack sees the footprints and he gets confused, and then Danny runs backwards and escapes and sees Wendy, and the two are reunited and they hug and kiss. And I remember watching the movie with my grandmother on my mom's side, who you met a few times back.
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
I remember.
And she was the type who she'd watch a movie and she would yell at the characters what to do. I mean, she really got into it. And she was yelling when Danny and Wendy were hugging and kissing, relieved to find each other again. She was yelling at him to get out of there. She thought Jack was going to come out and kill him.
Yeah.
But they finally do. They take their sweet time of it, but they finally do get in a Hallorann snowcat and drive away to safety.
But that's because Jack gets lost in the maze.
Yeah, I mean, had he not gotten lost, they might have, but he might have caught them both. But I think it's really fantastically acted there by Jack when he's like just starting to lose his balance and he's becoming disoriented and just growling aimlessly.
And saying things incoherent. I mean, just there's nothing coherent
Yeah.
about what he's. I mean, it's almost as if he's gotten so insane that he's devolved.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it. I mean, and who knows what kind of injury he suffered with the blow to the head with the baseball
Well, that's
bat.
true too.
And not to mention, what injuries he might have suffered falling down the steps, and then of course the knife on the hand and the baseball bat on the hand.
And we know he probably has a broken leg, which ironically, Charles Grady
Yeah.
also suffered a broken leg when he was found by the folks that recovered the bodies. He had apparently broken his leg. So, ironically, Jack Torrance
Yeah.
does just about everything that Charles Grady did, except the one thing that
Kill his family.
kill his family. That's it.
Yeah.
Everything else worked out exactly as Ullman was afraid might happen again.
Yeah, that's right. So it's really interesting how sometimes there's a message there. So many times people are determined not to become like certain people and end up becoming like them or even worse. I mean,
Right.
you go back to The Godfather, how in the beginning Michael is saying that he's not like his father, but then at the end, he does become like his father,
Right.
and possibly even worse. And so,
And in the end, and then by the very end, he ends up dying like his father. Even dying of a heart attack
oh yeah,
by the garden.
right, yeah, exactly. And so anyway, so the movie has a happy ending, at least to the point that Wendy and Danny survived. But yeah, it's really interesting watching Jack, where it's like hypothermia is setting in, and then obviously possibly brain damage, and but he could have bleeding in the brain,
Who knows?
because sometimes when people have a head injury, they initially don't appear to be seriously injured, but then
He's got a broken ankle or leg,
yeah.
something along the line.
And he has internal injuries that could be combining. Because, like I said, sometimes people with head injuries don't appear seriously injured at first, and they seem coherent. But then the bleeding in the brain or whatever sets in, and they
Right, the swelling,
Yeah.
the swelling kicks in, and
Yeah. So anyway, and then obviously there's that chilling shot of Jack, frozen to death the next morning.
the permanent Kubrick stare.
Yeah. It's a lot like what we saw earlier in the movie, where he was alive, obviously, but he was just sitting there with that, that eerie stare.
Yeah.
And so then finally we end. Well, actually, there's one scene that was cut. Are you aware of the scene that was cut after the initial
Yes,
release?
the scene at the hospital where, yeah.
For those of you who don't know, The Shining originally opened only in New York and Los Angeles, and after the first weekend of showing, Kubrick had one scene removed from the film, and basically Ullman visited Wendy in the hospital, saying that they found there's different accounts, but the preponderance of the evidence I've gotten from the few people who reported on it, as well as the script from the scene, which is posted online, and still photographs, is that Ullman told Wendy in the hospital that they did find Jack and Hallorann's bodies, but they didn't see any sign of any of the supernatural things that Wendy described, and she was probably just suffering. She probably had some hallucinations just because of her trauma. And then he goes out to Danny, and then Ullman goes out to Danny in the waiting room and gives him the ball that was given to him, that rolled out from room 237. So Kubrick supposedly just deemed the scene unnecessary.
And it kind of would have, it basically would have ended, if that scene did stay,
Yeah.
it would have ended on a bit of a Debbie Downer, because it's like, no matter how hard he tried to escape
Yeah.
his father's legacy,
Right.
there it is.
Yeah, and it should be noted also, I had always been confused that in the list of cast.
Nurse and policeman.
Right, exactly.
But it turns out that that is the only evidence that we have about that scene, that
yeah,
final scene.
Because of that was the only scene that those characters were in.
Right.
So anyway, then finally we go back and we see this, and it's really well done. You see a shot from a long distance of all these photographs on the wall, and it keeps on zooming in until finally you see from the July 4th, 1921, you see a picture of Jack at a party, and Jack is front row center, so obviously he had some prominent role there at the Overlook.
Right. Almost as if he was the master of ceremonies.
So you see it's like Jack has now apparently been absorbed into this hotel that he was a part of in the past, and who knows, maybe will be in future lives.
Yeah.
And
he was always the caretaker, and the Overlook knows it's always been there.
Yep. So now we know what Jack meant by the deja vu. And now, was reincarnation ever implied in the book at all?
No.
Okay, I didn't think so. I thought that was unique to the.
No, I think that was more unique. That was something that Kubrick was thinking about. He did mention that as far as when he explained in an interview about the final picture, that basically Jack was a reincarnation of a previous caretaker.
Yeah.
But it was assumed that he was talking about Charles Grady, the one that killed his wife and 2 kids, but that happened in 1970.
Yeah.
So it was probably just an older caretaker.
Well, so The Shining's 37 years old now. It had a budget of $12 million, grossed $44 million at the American box office. So it was a hit by any means, but it was not an overwhelming hit.
It actually was nominated for 2
Razzies. Razzies. For those of you who don't know, a Razzie is basically the opposite of the Oscars. It's awards for the worst in film.
Crazy. That was crazy.
Yeah.
Because I think Shelley Duvall should have won Best Actress.
Oh yeah, and I think Jack should have won Best Actor, and as Kubrick should have won Best Director. I mean,
Well, he should have won Best Director in all his films. But
oh yeah.
He never got that award.
Well, what's really interesting, I read that typically Kubrick's movies were not real well received by critics initially, but later became so later on. And I like it. I like The Shining more and more over the years. Certainly part of it is that I'm older and I can appreciate it more, that I work in film now. But I think another part of it, when I first started, when I first saw it, when I saw the ghosts, like the ball, and then like Lloyd in the gold room, I was like, well, what's going on here? And now that I come to accept it and understand the movie, I just accept it as part of the as a special part of the movie.
It's the hotel.
Yeah, and
all of its residents,
and
permanent residents.
And I think once the general weirdness of the movie wears off, I think people have liked it more, because it got basically a lukewarm reaction from critics when it came out, and now almost every critic, with very few exceptions, think it's a masterpiece. And I mean, I think now, is there any doubt that it's the best horror movie ever made? I mean, I know that it's a matter of opinion, but I don't even know if there's a close second to it in my book.
The only thing I would regard as far as a close second would be, actually a tie. Psycho, by Alfred Hitchcock, and Alien.
Yeah, I haven't seen Alien since the 80s, but I remember thinking it was good. But Psycho, I think it's a masterpiece. It's probably one of my top 10 or 20 movies of all time. But I don't consider it a pure horror movie the way I consider The Shining. Like I said, I think it's more of a suspense mystery.
Yeah.
But yeah, no question, it's an outstanding movie as well. And Anthony Perkins, one of the greatest, as Norman Bates, one of the greatest killers in movie history.
Oh yeah. So unprepossessing.
So yeah.
And that's basically what Stephen King wanted. Basically, an unprepossessing person to play Jack Torrance.
Yeah, but for what Kubrick wanted to do with it, I mean, he made the right choice. And,
yeah, I think he saw past the story that Stephen King wanted and thought, what would make it more real?
Yeah, that's right. And and he did it, and it's interesting that King submitted a screenplay for after Kubrick bought the movie rights. King submitted to Kubrick a screenplay, but Kubrick never read it, and instead he and Diane Johnson wrote the screenplay together. And again,
He didn't want King's undue influence.
obviously not, yeah, and Kubrick was once quoted as saying that he thought that, and you probably know that Kubrick and King took jabs at each other in the media over the years.
Yeah.
And Kubrick at one point said he thinks that King comes up with good story concepts, but is not that good a writer. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I love what Kubrick did with The Shining.
Right.
And one thing I do like about King's writing is that it is very character driven, which is something that I go for in my writing as well. Because to me, the writing as well as the acting are the two most important aspects of a film.
Absolutely.
And this film had that, but this is one of those films that the cinematography is just the cinematography and the production, the set design, just take it to a completely different level. I mean, I think if had this film been conventionally shot, it could have been a good thriller, but nothing more.
Right.
But Kubrick just was able to take it to a different world.
Well, I mean, he was the kind of guy that never does anything by half.
No, and I mean, it's interesting. Kubrick died in 1999 at the age of 70. He directed only 13 movies in his career, and they were over a span of 46 years, from 1953 to 1999. His last movie, Eyes Wide Shut, was actually released a few months after his death.
Based on a obscure Austrian novel from the 19th century.
Yeah, and it's interesting. He only made 2 movies after The Shining. There was Full Metal Jacket in '87, and then Eyes Wide Shut in '99.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's interesting, a 12-year gap between his last 2. And
well, I hope if you ever decide to do a Full Metal Jacket that you would consider me.
Oh, I absolutely would, definitely, yeah. And Blue Chips.
Pretty much anything Stanley Kubrick.
Oh, I will. A Clockwork Orange.
And don't forget Star Wars.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And I know that's not Kubrick, but yeah.
Well, not
yeah,
Kubrick,
yeah,
but
for an analysis, yeah. And
yeah.
Blue Chips as well, which I want to do at some time in conjunction with the college basketball season.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because I know that's one that you and I both really enjoyed back in the '90s.
I think it was a film that had a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think it's a great college basketball drama. I don't know how relevant it is to today. I think it is to at least some extent.
It still is,
yeah.
But of course we'll explain that when we get to that episode.
Yes, definitely. But yeah, one piece of trivia I was going to say, since I mentioned A Clockwork Orange, one thing I should note about Philip Stone, the British stage actor who played Delbert Grady, he
played Alex's father.
Well, yeah, but he did. But aside from that, I was going to say, he's the only person. Philip Stone is the only person to appear in 3 consecutive Kubrick movies. It was A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, and The Shining.
And Barry Lyndon was a very underrated film. I mean,
I haven't seen it, but yeah.
You should.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to see all of Kubrick's stuff eventually.
Now, I mean, at first you might find it a bit boring because it's a costume drama.
Yeah.
But trust me, watch the film.
Well, I will, and I know you have to more than scratch the surface of Kubrick's work to fully appreciate it. I mean, I'm glad that I'm doing this episode now when I've watched the Shining over a span of 36 years, from age 10 to age 46.
Yeah.
It's certainly, I think I can analyze movies much better when I've seen them over a long period of time, and they've meant different things to me at different points. And it's really interesting. I looked recently at the American box office of 1980. The Shining was the 14th highest grossing movie of the year. Grossed $44 million. I don't know what it did internationally. Obviously something, but the thing is, I looked at the movies, the 13 movies that grossed more than The Shining did that year, and of the 13, the only one I remember thinking is probably more famous today would be The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, obviously anything in Star Wars is going to be,
And we got to do that one.
Yeah.
Too.
But, yeah, there's like I think Smokey and the Bandit 2 was ahead of The Shining. Obviously, no comparison in the legacy of those movies.
Well, I blame that on drive-ins. A lot
Yeah.
of drive-ins, a lot of cheap entertainment, and hey,
Yeah.
a lot of the films that I watched in the 70s and 80s, the first half of the 80s especially, were in drive-ins.
Oh yeah, I went to the Skyline Drive-In on the outskirts of my hometown of Madison, Indiana, quite a few times. I have a lot of great memories of that, and I remember the tickets were really cheap.
Of
you know,
course, yeah.
And yeah, it was fun, and
Especially when they have, dollar car nights.
I don't remember that. I remember they had $5 car nights there at the Skyline, but
Yeah.
and then I used to, on a trivial note, I used to regularly drive past Seymour, past the drive-in, I think it was the Stardust. It appeared in John Mellencamp's video of his hit single "Small Town"
Yeah.
back in 1985, and it was torn down 92, 93, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Typical time when drive-ins were starting to drop like flies.
Well, the drive-in that I saw Star Wars in, New Albany Drive-In Theater, it's now Home Depot.
Yeah, there's a trailer. I think it's a trailer, home lot, or a trailer. It has something to do with trailer parks. I think you buy trailer. I think you buy trailers there where the Skyline Drive-In was.
Oh boy.
But I'm not sure. I don't remember where the Stardust Drive-In was in Seymour, but I know the drive-in's gone because it was visible from 65, from I-65 when you drove by.
Yeah.
But anyway, The Shining, of course, is very easily available. It was released on DVD originally early in that format, and with only one disc. Then in 2007, this double disc was released, which I have and I recommend highly. Disc 1 contains not only the movie, but a very interesting audio commentary, both by the aforementioned cinematographer Garrett Brown, who gives a lot of great stories from the making of the movie. Unfortunately, Kubrick had died by that point, but Brown, he was there for a lot of the filming, and he gives a lot of great stories about it. And also, there's a historian named John Baxter who contributes to the audio commentary as well. I think he wrote a biography about Kubrick, I'm not sure. And then disc 2 contains a documentary on the making of The Shining that was made by Vivian Kubrick, Stanley Kubrick's daughter, who was I think only 17 at the time. She's actually become a political activist in recent years. I don't think she's ever gone into film, at least not to a great extent. But anyway, it was made at the time the movie was being made, rather than a retrospective. And then there are a few other documentaries on there as well. So, and then I think there's I haven't played this track, but I think there's like an isolated musical score or something like that. I think that's what this is. I haven't played that track. But anyway, it should be noted that Wendy Carlos, who did the music for that, was actually is a very highly accomplished composer. Who's in class, has done a lot of classical albums. And actually, the early, originally released under the name Walter Carlos, and then later began living as a woman under the name Wendy Carlos, the name Wendy being ironic for this movie. So, in fact, actually, if you go on YouTube, there's a clip from an American Top 40 episode where Casey Kasem actually tells the story of Wendy / Walter Carlos. And mentions that after the sex change that Wendy created the music for The Shining. But the reason why it was mentioned is that under the name Walter Carlos, he released an album in the early 70s that spent I think 108 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Classical chart, which I think is the all-time record for most weeks at #1 on any Billboard chart. So, piece of trivia there about the Walter / Wendy Carlos, the composer of The Shining. And anyway, so closing thoughts, Robert. What's the legacy of The Shining?
The legacy of The Shining is basically, once again, you have a master cinematographer taking a genre that has, at that point, been reduced to a cliche, the slasher films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, even Alien to a certain extent, blood and gore, and just this cliched, predictable slasher, kill, murder, that sort of stuff. And he takes that genre and he takes it back to a whole different level. He elevates it to a completely higher level. And ironically, the way he does that is to take the horror genre back to its roots, back to its literary roots.
Yeah.
With the Gothic horrors of the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, it's very well said, and that I think you really hit the nail on the head with it. And I think to me, it's just what makes the movie work is the complete package together. You have outstanding performances across the board from all the actors involved. Maybe as spectacularly shot as any movie has ever been, or maybe as spectacular as any set design has ever been. Very powerful music that enhances the terror. And you put it all together and it's just something that's extraordinary, something that it's like an expensive bottle of wine that just keeps getting better with age.
It's now become, as far as I'm concerned, the platinum standard as to what horror should be.
It is, and I think that so many horror, I think that the genre has just strayed so badly in the decades since this movie came out. It's been over a third of a century now, amazingly, and if anything, the pattern that was happening just before The Shining came out has just not only continued onwards, regardless, it just gotten worse. Yeah, and there are movies that have a lot more killings, a lot more blood, but have far less terror and suspense.
Right.
And so,
because it's all become cliched, standardized, Hollywood.
It has, but this is a movie that people are going to remember.
Because it's more than just a movie.
Yeah.
It's art.
Yeah.
And that's the way Stanley Kubrick always approached just about every film, starting with Lolita.
Yeah, and he took it extremely seriously, and he had that autistic, obsessive mindset to just be able to immerse himself for years in a project.
Yeah.
I could have never put that kind of work into something, without going crazy. But, he did, and people like us are the beneficiaries from it, And,
exactly.
And I think, the fact that 37 years later, you and I are sitting here, we were 9 years old when the movie came out, and that 37 years we're still, sitting here trying to figure out what some of the stuff means. That's the ultimate compliment you can give. That's the ultimate compliment you can give to a filmmaker.
What was that grand chess master thinking?
Yeah.
I mean, and that again.
Yeah.
Beginning, middle, and end. It has to do with Stanley Kubrick.
There are movies from that age and older that I still enjoy watching, but there aren't many where I still am trying to, unravel the puzzle and figure out what something means, and the fact that I care what it means, that's and it's an extraordinary compliment to the filmmaker. So, well, any last words about The Shining?
Well, I guess if you want to condense The Shining in just a few words, maybe it's something that Stanley Kubrick himself said about The Shining.
Yeah.
It's the story of one man's family going quietly insane together.
Yep. And I think it's a movie people are going to remember forever and ever and ever. Well, after the All the Right Moves episode last Sunday, I told you it wouldn't be 427 more days until my next episode. It was only 5 this time, so I'm going to try to stay closer to that than the 427. But anyway, thanks for bearing with us. For nearly 3 hours, we've actually talked longer than the movie is by about the movie. Let's see, is 144 minutes. So yeah, we've talked 24 minutes longer than the movie is. So. if you've made it to the end, thanks. I hope it's been worthwhile. And thanks to Robert Landrum for providing his great insight. Hope he'll be back with us for many more episodes in the future. So anyway, this concludes episode 17. As always, thank you so much for joining us, and I cordially invite you to do so again in the near future for episode 18. And of course, feel free to share this video and to like Super Deep Movie Analysis on Facebook. Till next time, for Robert Landrum, this is Lec Zorn saying thank you and good night. Shine on.
Forever and ever and ever.